Welcome, everyone, to Nerd of the Rings. Today, I am honored to welcome Mr. Brian Sibley to the channel. He is the author of numerous books, including the official movie guides for the Middle-earth films, the authorized biography of Peter Jackson, as well as the writer for one of my personal favorites, the 1981 BBC radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Mr. Sibley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Matt. It's lovely to be with you.
So we were talking a little bit before we started recording here. This actually, 2021 marks the 40th anniversary of the BBC radio drama.
It does, and we are now we are in what would have been the week of the third episode, and in fact, the day on which, well, no, I think tomorrow on the day in which we're talking. Would be the broadcasting of the third episode, which was the Black Riders. So yeah, 40 years on, very, very curious for me reflecting on it, because it was a series which totally changed my life, my career, and apart from anything else, I'm going to explain that in a minute, but apart from anything else, it installed me as a part of the Tolkien industry, I think I have to say now, but it wasn't so much then. But for me, it was a watershed, because I had been writing for radio. I loved radio. I grew up listening to radio, and I adored what a friend of mine called many years ago the theatre of the mind. And you know, the idea, which we probably may touch back on, but is that on radio you can do all kinds of things that you can't do on film. Well, of course, you can do them on film, but what I mean by that is that it has a completely different nuance, because what you're creating, it's a joint creation. It's not just the writer or the actor. It's a relationship with the listener, because as you describe characters or scenes, or as the actors play their parts, you, the listener, start co-creating the images that are there, you know, and that's what makes it so unique. So I loved radio, and I'd grown up listening to it all the time. I loved radio drama. It did introduce me to masses of books and by different authors who I was previously unaware of. And I had done one drama, 45 minutes long. I point this out because The Lord of the Rings was 26 half-hour episodes.
And
I was writing with a very established colleague called Michael Bakewell. But at the time, I had written one 45-minute play based on a book by American writer James Thurber. A very slight story, but a lovely story. And the BBC in those days, it's all very different now, but in those days it was very much, it was a bit of a kind of a club, really. And if people liked what you did, they would come back and say, is there something else you'd like to do? So the BBC said to me, what else would you like to do? And I offered them the recently published at the time, posthumous book, Morris, by Ian Forster. I was a recently out young gay man, and I thought the book was amazing. And I thought it was incredible that Forster had been made to suppress, well, through his own choice, suppress the book until after his death. Well, it was too strong meat for the BBC, so they said, no, we can't do that. Subsequently, of course, it was made as a movie and big success. But back then, we're talking 1970, end of 79, they wouldn't have contemplated doing that on the BBC. So what else would you like to do? And I drew up a list of, I don't know, probably a dozen books that I was infatuated with that I would like to do. And at the end of the list, and this is absolutely true, I put, or maybe The Lord of the Rings. And I put it because it seemed like the least likely thing that anybody would do, you know. I mean, it's huge, and it's 3 volumes, and how much would it cost, and how would you do it? Anyway, in those days, you could wander in and out of the BBC, not now, of course, at a moment's notice. And I was young, impoverished, really. I'd only recently gone into freelance after years in local government and banking and doing things I hated. I was now trying to earn my living as a writer. So I used to, if I'm honest, whenever I went to London, I would go into the BBC's broadcasting house, their head place,
Yeah.
because I knew that I could wander into the canteen and get a cheap meal. So I was on my way to get a cheap lunch when a guy called Richard Imeson, who was head of what was called the script unit, he was the person who was responsible for not necessarily commissioning all the things, but sort of lining up writers with projects and so on. I did a lot of commissioning. And he happened to come out of his office as I was walking down the corridor, and he grabbed me by the sleeve and pulled me into his office and shut the door and said in a kind of hiss at me, "Who told you?" And I said, who told me what? And he said, about the Lord of the Rings. And I thought, I don't know what he's talking about. So I said, what do you mean, who told me? What am I supposed to have known? You must have heard. Who's the mole? Somebody in this building has told you. And I said, told me what? So he then revealed that the BBC was at that very moment negotiating with Saul Zaentz, who they assumed, wrongly actually, but they assumed was the person who held the copyright in the book, because he had been the person behind the making of the Banshee film and the Rankin Bass Hobbit and so on.
Right.
They assumed that he had the rights, and they were negotiating with him to do a radio dramatization. I had no idea. It took a long time to convince this man. I had no knowledge of that. So at the end of it, the end of the conversation, he said, "Well, look, I don't know whether we're going to pull this off, but if we do, do you want to be involved in some way?" And I said, do I want to be? So that's how it began. Of course, in fact, Saul Zaentz, it turned out, did not own the copyright to the radio air broadcast version of the books. And having paid quite a lot of money to Mr. Zaentz, they then had to get it back, the BBC, and renegotiate with the Tolkien estate, who still owned the radio rights.
Wow.
So there was quite a lapse of time when all that went on. But true to his word, when they finally signed, they came back to me and said, "We would like you to prepare the book in 26 parts for half a year of broadcasting, basically." And I vainly, because I was innocent and ambitious, and when you're young, you think you can do no wrong. Right. I mean, now when I look back at it, I think, how the hell did I ever think that I could do this? I had no basis for thinking that I had the ability to be able to write that. But at the time, I thought, right, great. So I was terribly offended initially that they said you can do 13 of the episodes. You can structure it how it's going to be, break it down into the 26 parts, give us a total synopsis for how you're going to do it. And then you can write half of the episodes, and the other half will be written by a guy called Michael Bakewell, whose name I knew. He was a producer and adapter. He'd done War and Peace for the BBC, so he knew how to do big projects. Yeah. On hindsight, years later, someone said to me, "Well, actually, of course, what the BBC thought was that if Sibley screws up, well, we've got this hugely experienced man who can just step in." But whatever the truth of it, they took a flyer on me. And so I spent the next 6 months preparing the book to be, broken down into episodes, what the plot would be, who would be involved, which characters would be involved in which episodes. I mean, you might want to know more about that, because it's a very interesting challenge. Yeah. And then spent another 6 months writing my 13 episodes and working with Michael where we overlapped, or where one of us left and the other one came in. And then another 3 months in studio recording the episodes. So it's all a long, long time ago. But on the 8th of March, this is the front cover of what was a magazine called the Radio Times, which is it's a listing magazine of what's on BBC radio and television. It's still called Radio Times, although now it's all television and whatever's going on other platforms. Right. But cover art was by a man called Eric Fraser, who was a very established artist. Tolkien fans will know that he first of all redrew the pictures by the then Princess, now Queen of Denmark, for the Folio Society's Lord of the Rings, and himself illustrated The Hobbit. And when I knew that he was going to do the cover art, my dad had worked in commercial art just before the war, and had always sort of alerted me to the work of great artists, and he loved Eric Fraser's work. So I'd grown up knowing about all these artists and seeing the Radio Times every week. I used to go through and look for the piece of art by the by names I'd heard of. And so I thought, I heard he was going to do the cover. I thought, wow, I must get that cover. So I wrote to Eric Fraser, care of the art editor at the magazine, and said, could I buy it? And he wrote back, and he was a bit surprised because he hadn't actually drawn it at that point. And the idea of somebody wanting to buy something which he hadn't drawn
hadn't done yet.
Weird. Anyway, yeah, he said, if I get it back from the BBC, then we could make a deal, he said. And he said, use your influence to encourage them to give me back my artwork. I didn't know I had no influence. I didn't know who I was. Anyway, I duly told the art editor that I had a deal with Mr. Fraser, and eventually the piece of art, for the price of 40 guineas, which is 40 pounds and 40 shillings, I should have translated that into there's the original art for the for the cover and a poster, because the BBC made it into a poster. So very, very precious to me. And this year it's hung on the wall for 40 years, but this year I find myself looking at it quite a lot.
So you mentioned the challenge of adapting the Lord of the Rings. What was your process like, deciding what to keep and what to cut? A couple popular examples, obviously there's a group of fans that, really want to see Tom Bombadil in pretty much everything. Excuse me. But one thing that you all did keep was the Scouring of the Shire, which the very first time that I listened to it, I was very pleasantly surprised. I thought that was pulled off really well. So how did you go through that process of what to keep versus what to cut?
Well, it was very difficult. And the main difficulty is the fact, as you're aware, that once the Fellowship has broken, that Tolkien no longer tells the story chronologically.
Right.
He tells you about Sam, Frodo, and Gollum. He tells you about Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. He tells you about Merry and Pippin, and cuts between the three main threads, plus all the other. They're not incidental, but all the other characters that come on, like Theoden and Denethor and so on. So the real problem for me was not just knowing that I had to make it chronological, because I had half-hour episodes, and if I'd followed Tolkien's system, well, you would have had maybe 4, 5, 6 episodes with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and then you'd have gone back in time for 4 or 5 episodes and had Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, which obviously wasn't going to work. It had to be chronological. But of course I knew, because I'd read Tolkien's letters, I knew that Tolkien was very, very strongly against the idea of the story ever being presented chronologically, which of course is nonsense. I mean, my admiration for the professor is unbounded, but the man was wrong. He was not a novelist, and actually, in saying that, therein lies the strength of the book. The fact that he was not somebody who was writing for a living, writing novels for a living. That he wasn't, and of course, in the period we're talking about, editors didn't work in the way they do today. I mean, today an editor would have thrown the book back at him and said, "You can't possibly have a structure like this. You've got to into some chronological page-turning way." So that was the first hurdle. Everything was fine up to the breaking of the Fellowship, and from then, how was I going to do it? So basically, I followed the appendix to The Return of the King, because in the Tale of Years, at the back of the Lord of the Rings, Appendix B, you have listed there every single date where something happened. Now, in the book, it's kind of Tolkien tells you where we are in relation to what other people are doing. by things like pointing out the phasing of the moon. So
Right.
one character will see a full moon, and then several chapters on, you see another group of characters, but they're seeing that moon that was referred to earlier. Excuse me. So I thought I'm going to follow that chronology, but of course, then I had to work out how always to have all of these groups of characters in every episode, which was, important for lots of reasons. Partly because some of them were star names, Ian Holm particularly, playing Frodo, and for British listeners now, probably for other people know of his work as well, but actors like Sir Michael Hordern and Robert Stevens, Sir Robert Stevens, these were names that people knew. It was part of what was going to make people listen to the series, so they all had to be somehow or other in every episode. And that in itself is a nightmare, because the Fellowship, that's the problem with the first half of the book, that you have 9 key characters. And of course, they don't all speak in the book at all. I mean, people don't think about it. But if you're watching Jackson's film, for instance, there are loads of scenes where the 9 are there, but they don't all have a piece of dialogue, but they're there in the background or to one side. So you're aware of them as a fellowship. On radio, if somebody doesn't speak or doesn't have a vocal presence, they're not there. So what do? Do you invent kind of lame language like that's what I think too, or so say I, or something like that, in order to establish they're all there? Quite a challenge, actually. From the moment of the breaking of the Fellowship, basically, I followed Tolkien's list of dates and events, and then I always tried to find a cliffhanger. So 30 minutes in or 29 minutes in, something would happen that either anticipated something that was going to happen, or something dramatic occurred, which would leave you waiting for the next episode. And that's the old trick of every soap opera that's ever been done, that you want people saying, I must hear next week. And that was all of that I enjoyed. I was wise enough. Very early on, I said to Michael Bakewell, because I knew it was going to have 13 episodes, he was going to have 13. I didn't know how it was going to be done. Nobody said to me, well, you have 1 to 13 and Michael has 14 to 26. Nobody told me that. So I thought, well, I have to find out how we're going to split the work. So I said to Michael, how do you think we should do it? Wanting to be inclusive, and he said, simple. He said, this is your project, which was incredibly gracious of him. You take whatever episodes you want, and I'll do the rest.
Wow.
But I wasn't stupid enough to not stop and think, what can I do the best, knowing how inexperienced I was. And I knew that the Battle of Pelennor Field would not be something I had the faintest idea really how to tackle. I could work out the synopsis for the scene, what had to be in it and where you come from too. But actually writing dialogue for people in a battle, I didn't know how to do that. So I chose for myself the first few chapters. So all the stuff to do with the Shire, leading up to Bree. So there was some action stuff in there, but basically it was the kind of stuff that I felt most comfortable with. And I chose the end chapters from Mount Doom. So I did have the episode at Mount Doom where the ring is thrown away. And then I had a bit in the middle, which I think was around the Dead Marshes. I'm not entirely sure. But left to Michael all the really difficult stuff, the ride out, the ride of the Rohirrim, Theoden, and Gandalf when they ride to Helm's Deep, all of those things I had no idea really how to do. But we worked very closely, and there were quite a number of times where Michael would ring me up and say, look, I'm really stuck here. I don't know how to get this last bit into my episode. Can you pick it up? Can you deal with it? Or I'd say to him, I'm running a bit short here. Is there anything you can unload back to me, and how can we do it? So we worked very closely like that. And I learned a lot from him because he was an immensely experienced writer. So I was really lucky. I mean, for me, it was like the beginning of a career which I might have spent years trying to establish for myself, because the series got huge publicity. And everybody started tuning into it. And, you know, people just, because we're talking about a time before you could rerun the stuff that you'd missed, you know, which we're also used to now. I mean, you can just pick it up later on a podcast or on a watch again platform. Well, we didn't have any of that. So it was a case of hear it or miss it.
Right.
Now, on Sunday lunchtime, for many people, it was their mid-Sunday event. You know, it was just had to be there. You had to be at home, or you were driving to Granny's for Sunday lunch, and you listened to it in the car on the way or whatever. And then it went out late at night on Wednesday night, the repeat. And I don't think I was alone in recording live from radio on cassette recording both of those episodes. I had to have both episodes, you know. I had to record them both, pressing the buttons at the right moment, you know, as hoping the tape wouldn't snarl up or whatever. So it became a real event for people, which it wouldn't be today, but it was then. And in fact, so much so that I remember going to a local corner store where I lived to pick up a newspaper, and I don't know whether they do in the States, but they put in the windows little cards saying buggy for sale, or secondhand this or secondhand that, and babysitting services, window cleaning services, that kind of thing. And there was a card in this window. Obviously, the person didn't know that I lived in this area, in the area where they were sticking their card in the window, saying, "We'll trade any episode of The Lord of the Rings for episode 8, which I missed." So that's how manic people were. That particular person, I was able to copy it and give them a copy of it, so that was fine. But it was obsessive. People bought the poster of that cover in their hundreds. I remember the BBC asked me to write all the copy for the back of it. And I was pretty pushy as a youngster, really, I now realise. And I said, "Well, what are you going to pay me?" And they said £200, I think it was, which was quite a lot of money. And I said, "No, I want a royalty. I want 1 penny on every poster you sell." Anyway, they wouldn't give in to me. And eventually it became this great, massive thing where I was told that I would ruin the whole event by withholding my copyright or my willingness to do it. And so I caved in and did it. And of course, the thing sold out, the very first printing, and went on selling for zillions and zillions of copies. I mean, I'd have made an absolute fortune just out of writing the blurb about Tolkien and the actors of the story on the back of the poster. However, there we are. And the cover rather, which I managed to obtain years later, well, 2 years ago, actually, there was an auction in London where all of Eric Fraser's other drawings came up for sale, because every week in the Radio Times, he did a little drawing. And I mean, I'll give you, I should mention this actually, first of all. This is the article that appeared in the Radio Times when the magazine came out. That's me, by the way, there, sitting on the side here, talking to the North Farthing Smile of the Tolkien Society. We're all dressed up as elves and goblins and wizards and whatnot. And the Tolkien Society did fantastically, because right at the end of the article, which did, if you weren't happy with cosplay, would have made you feel a bit uncomfortable, but it said at the end, the address of the Tolkien Society is, and then the address of the then secretary. And people, they were astonished that people wrote in their hundreds, and the membership of the Tolkien Society zoomed up as a result of it. So, you know, it really was a kind of weird phenomenon at the time. I mean, now looking back, I think, gosh, you know, it's amazing that it all happened at the time, because I think when you're young, you think anything's possible and everything will happen. I just assumed, I wasn't surprised. I just thought, well, that's exactly how, you know, of course it would be like that.
Right.
But this is the page on the day of the actual broadcast. Now, that little drawing in the middle here, that's, I'm going to go the other way. Here we are. I can't get used to doing things backwards. Can you see it now? No, you can't. There we are.
A little bit over. There you go.
There you go. There. So that, he did one of those for every one of the 26 episodes. 3 of them weren't published because there was an industrial strike and the Radio Times couldn't print. But 2 years ago, all of these drawings came up for auction at Sotheby's, the auction house. Here's one of them, which is was used on the cassette boxes and on the back of the poster, and shows Gandalf strangely holding the ring, which he only does, of just fleetingly in the book, with obviously Frodo and Sam behind. And I managed to buy, I nearly paupered myself, but I managed to buy all of the art relating to the radio series, which, yeah, so it was a challenge, but because I was young and hungry, I don't mean hungry, I mean ambitiously hungry.
Yeah.
I thought I can do it, whatever it is, I can do it. It's not going to be a problem. And I was a bit of a pain in the studio. I think the producer, I don't think I know, the producer actually came to dread my being there, because if I mispronounced anything, I would say, no, you can't do that. No, it's not that, it's this. You know, and of course some of the names are quite, as you know, the language of Middle Earth, or the place names, for example, they're quite a challenge. And actors, you know, have got a long speech to, particularly Aragorn. I mean, Robert Stevens had lots of problems because, you know, trying to create a character, but then say Emin Muel or Cirith Ardor or something, or, you know, in the middle of your speech, just come like a foreign language out of nowhere, was a real challenge for him. Christopher Tolkien made an audio cassette which we could play to the actors with how to pronounce all the names of places. But frankly, you know, they'd listen to it a couple of times, and then of course when it looms up halfway through a long speech, they've then forgotten how to say it. So it was a real challenge for some of the actors. But you know, it was a fantastic cast. And Ian Holm was, well, and of course I'll come on to it, I'm sure, but Ian Holm, of course, would later play Bilbo. And his Frodo was, he knew the book inside out and back to front, and he studied so much of how it was going to be. I mean, he would frequently we only had an hour, a day and a half for each half-hour episode to rehearse and record. But he would often do several takes because he wanted to find a different nuance to the performance or whatever. Other actors, quite different. Michael Hordern, who played Gandalf, didn't understand anything about the book at all. He had no idea what it meant. He'd never read the book. He only read the scripts, and he only read the scripts as they were delivered to him. So when in the Mines of Moria, on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, Gandalf plunges to his fate, he rather grumpily came into the control booth and said to the producer, Jane, I'm very confused. My agent said I was in, I think it's 17, 18 episodes. I seem to have died in this episode. No, Michael, it's fine. You're resurrected in 3 episodes' time. And he went, oh, splendid. And, you know, for him, that was it. He just did whatever it said on the page, but did it extraordinarily well. I mean, there's something about his performance that you just, well, I still find it deeply moving. And if he didn't understand it, then that just shows how good actor he was. And the other person I have to mention is Peter Woodthorpe, who played Gollum. And Peter Woodthorpe had played Gollum in the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings Part 1. And he was just extraordinary because he just lived the part. And there were extraordinary moments in studio with him and Ian Holm and Bill Nighy, then called William Nighy, who played Sam, in the 3 of them. Which were physical. I mean, you know, this is actors standing around a microphone with bits of paper in their hand, turning the page and reading on.
Yeah.
But there were moments where he and Ian grappled with one another. And there's a moment where Frodo subdues Gollum, and you know, Holm was sort of forcing Peter down onto the studio floor. It was extraordinary to watch, really. I mean, they're all dressed in their usual, you know, sneakers and trainers.
Right.
But inside they were all living it. They were living it, and I think that's what people picked up on, really.
Absolutely, yeah. I am just in awe of the cast and the performance. I just so easily get sucked in to the story, and one of the things I thought was interesting as someone who was originally introduced through the Peter Jackson films is how similar really the actors from the radio drama are, to the film actors and vice versa. I think of Gandalf, obviously, and I mean, honestly, the one that's probably the most different is Ian Holm as Frodo. But it's kind of crazy that I think anyone who's a fan of the films, if you just jumped into the middle, you could probably guess which character it is just by the voice. It's kind of eerie how similar they are.
Well, the thing about the voices was very early on. The producer, Jane Morgan, was adamant that what she didn't want was funny voices. I don't know whether you know the Mind's Eye American radio production.
Yeah.
Where, how me tell like that? It's kind of, somebody thought they needed to be cartoony. I mean, I can't criticize the voices, particularly in either the Rankin Bass Hobbit or the Backsheet, because there's some great actors in those providing the voices there.
Yeah.
And apart from Peter Woodthorpe in the Backsheet, Michael Graham Cox, who played Boromir again in the radio version. So there's some great voices. But what Jane wanted to do was two things. First of all, she didn't want silly voices, funny voices, but she wanted to make sure that all of the voices, particularly of the Fellowship, all were so distinct that you didn't ever have to think, is that Merry or is that Pippin? Merry and Pippin were probably the closest because they were both young actors.
Right.
But if it was Legolas and Gimli, there was no doubt which actor you were listening to. So she had an ear for that. She was a great, still is actually, a very, very experienced producer, and has produced masses of very character-driven books for radio, particularly Dickens. I mean, she's done masses of Dickens. And so she was tuned in to knowing what voices would work well against other voices and so on.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. But of course, it isn't accidental that either the characters have similarity with Peter's, Jackson, that is, or that the structure of the films is very close to the structure of the radio version. Because Peter had the cassette version of this radio version. And when he was traveling from Wellington to Auckland as a young student, he was traveling by bus. He listened to, he wasn't a great reader of books at that point. He was a picker up of stuff in other ways, audio particularly. So he listened to it on cassette, traveling up to Auckland to go to college. And it's not accidental that much of the same structure, I think. I don't think I'm claiming something there that isn't there. And indeed, once in an unguarded moment, Jackson said something to the effect of, "Well, we're following your scenario here," or something. And they did actually say, he and Fran said of the last episode where I had kept back some dialogue between Frodo and Sam at the Grey Haven. So I'd kept it back so that you would hear Frodo's voice just before Sam went back into Bag End and said, "Well, I'm back."
Right.
And in Sam's head, you hear Frodo say, "There's so much for you to be and to do."
Yeah.
And Fran said, "Well, we stole your ending." By the way. But it's not accidental. But in a way, that for me is all the more remarkable that I was in love with the books. I mean, I haven't talked about how I came to read the book and why I love Tolkien. But for me, this accidental event of saying I'd like to do the Lord of the Rings, which was beyond the bounds of possibility, ended up with my being involved and going on being involved with stuff to do with Tolkien 40 years later.
Yeah. So you touched on it, and usually it's my first question I ask people. I think I was just anxious.
Say anything, actually. I'm just nonstop talking.
No, you're great. I think I started with the radio drama because I was excited to get to that. But yeah, tell us how you got first introduced to Tolkien.
I read The Hobbit from the school library. I can still see the copy. It was a very rather boring grey, black and white cover. And I loved it. It was, and I loved it because I was a very, very slow reader. Not the best person in the world to have to handle anything to do with long books. I still am very, very slow. I tend to remember most of what I read because I read slowly. I've read late in life. I was quite, I wasn't the smartest kid on the block, and was very late to reading. But I loved books and I loved being read too. But I was either, I think now I would say that I was very probably dyslexic, but nobody knew or didn't have a label to put on it at that time. Today, probably I would have been helped better.
Yeah.
So I read The Hobbit and loved it. And then I thought I need to read The Lord of the Rings. So I got it out of the library, public library, and realized it was 3 volumes because they had it as sort of 3 separate volumes. And I couldn't cope with the prologue. There was this long prologue which Tolkien wrote setting up, about the history and pipeweed and all this. And I just got bogged down in it. And I thought, and then I kept looking at how long it was, and I'd flick through it and I'd see all these long words and names that I didn't understand. And so I didn't read it. In the meanwhile, however, I was intrigued enough about Tolkien to pick up whatever else came along. So I found Farmer Jars of Ham and Smith and Wotton Major when it was first published, and The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. This copy, which of course is close to, because it's from the Red Book of Westmarch, so it's the book that supposedly contains the stories and verses written down by Bilbo and Frodo. So it's got a strong link with The Hobbit. And I love the illustrations by Pauline Baynes, who later became a very close friend of mine, but not known at that time. And I wanted to send Tolkien something. By this time, I had bought the 3 volumes. I still hadn't read it, but I bought them. So I wrote him a fan letter. I copied out some of the runes around the edge of the Hobbit cover, and I wrote something in Quenya. I don't know where I got it from, somewhere in the Lord of the Rings. I don't know why I did, because I mean, like, why would you write to Tolkien and write something that he had written in a rather bad facsimile of his immaculate Elvish handwriting? Anyway, I did. I mean, thank God I don't have the letter, which was probably toe-curlingly embarrassing. But anyway, I couldn't afford to send these 3 big volumes to him. So I thought, this is ideal. It's thin, it's light, it won't cost much to send, and I can include the postage for its return, which I did. So I sent it care of his publishers, George Allen and Unwin. And it came back, with a letter from a lady called M. Joy Hill, who was press officer. There it is. And she will be known to many Tolkien people because it was to Joy Hill that Tolkien left the rights in Bilbo's last song.
Right.
And she wrote, "Dear Mr. Sibley, Professor," this is 1969, 15th of January. "Dear Mr. Sibley, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien has asked me to return your copy of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which he has autographed on the title page. And you will also see that on page 60, Professor Tolkien has made a correction to the last line of the poem on that page. Yours sincerely, for George Allen Unwin, M. Joy Hill, press officer." And on page 60, which is the last verse of the poem called The Sea Bell, there is the correction. I mean, it's tiny. So let me put it up. Whoops. Up. There we are. You can see it now.
Yeah.
Oh, wrong way.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. He's added the word I to the last line. So it says, "To myself I talk, for still they speak, not men that meet." And it's men that I meet. So you put that in. And he signed the title page. And some years later, I met for the first time Pauline Baynes, and with a great deal of effort, because she was very reluctant to sign the book, because she said it's worth a lot of money with the professor's signature in, and I don't want to spoil it. And I said, but your name's on the title page as well. And I finally persuaded her to sign it, and there it is.
That's fantastic.
with both his signature and hers, which is, I guess, probably, I'm not saying it's one of the most valuable things that I own, but it's certainly one of the most precious things that I own.
Absolutely.
So I didn't follow up the conversation, probably the correspondence. Probably if I had have done, I might have, it might have gone on. But I was just thrilled to have had anything back.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I still hadn't really read the big book. That's the problem. And then when I was 21, I got a thing called a duodenal ulcer, which meant I had to go into hospital. In those days, not now, but in those days, people with ulcers you had to lie on a hospital bed for 3 or 4 weeks and eat nothing but slops and do nothing. So it's horrible.
Yeah.
And I thought, what am I going to do while I'm lying in this hospital bed for weeks? So I got my parents to bring me 2 things. The book, which was then in a 1-volume paperback, very famous volume, which many people will be familiar with, which was for my generation, a kind of a Bible, really. It's this with Pauline Bain's cover and the back, showing the Shire, and on the back Mount Doom and Minas Tirith, and a torch. And I started I forgot the prologue. I left the prologue. I just started with chapter 1, Long Awaited Party, and just read and was totally hooked by about page 70 or 80. Couldn't put it down, under the covers at night like a kid of 6 with a torch, reading after lights out. So that's how I got bitten by the Tolkien bug. I mean, I'm not an erudite scholar of Tolkien in the way that so many people I know and friends that I have, I mean, the Thomas Shippies and the people, I'm not in their league in any means, but I've never lost my passion for the books, and of course, spending such a close amount of time on the Lord of the Rings in adapting it, I have a kind of different kind of feeling to it about the book, because I read it first of all just loving it, and then I read it again trying to dissect it and see how it worked, what made it work. So that's my kind of relationship with it now. The day coming up shortly, which is Tolkien Reading Day. I don't know if you know about Tolkien Reading Day.
Absolutely.
And I'm reading The Black Gates Open, which is the chapter I've chosen to read for my slot. And just the moment I started just reading it through again and just thinking, gosh, I love the language. I love the kind of formal, almost historic style of writing that Tolkien uses, particularly in those grand episodes of drama, and the way that just sits cheek by jowl in the book alongside the humor, with Merry and Pippin, or the early Hobbit episodes, alongside the mysticism of things like the scenes in Lothlorien with Galadriel, for example, and the humor and tragedy mixed in the episodes with Frodo and Gollum and Sam. I just love the way the whole book. I mean, as I say, no editor today, I think, would say to Tolkien, "Yeah, you've got it absolutely right." Most editors would say this element doesn't work or that doesn't work, but it works with him or for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned Tolkien Reading Day. That obviously, if you're not familiar with it, it'll have passed by the time this episode comes out. But it's a great day to celebrate Tolkien's works. It lines up with the destruction of the One Ring on March 25th, and every year, especially now that we're in a more virtual world today, they have a lot of online events, and the all day. What you referred to is the all day, people sign up for slots and everything. I think I go a couple hours after you, actually. I'm going to be reading some from Helm's Deep. So I'm looking forward to just letting that play all day as people read from Tolkien. So with adapting for the audio drama format, you mentioned there's some unique challenges, and I would imagine there's some unique things, almost advantages with that format as well. How did that come into play when you were making Lord of the Rings, and maybe what were some of the challenges and how did you overcome those?
Well, yeah, there are real challenges. I mean, we used a narrator. I think today, where I'm doing it now, I've done lots of dramas since. I dramatized all the Chronicles of Narnia, all 7 of those books. And those, I began using a narrator with those, but from that, I moved on to what is a real challenge, which is to tell a drama without having a storyteller, actually. And I've done that with the Gorman Gas novels of Mervyn Peake, and with T.H. White's huge epic Arthurian romance, The Once and Future King. And I've managed to do it. And I think if I was doing it today, I wouldn't use, I would try not to anyway. The challenge would be not to use a storyteller. But having a storyteller enabled us to deal with those things like place and location and description. Because the worst thing in the world is where actors have to describe things.
Right.
You know, the actor Timothy West wrote a humorous play once for radio, which was called "This Gun in My Left Hand is Loaded," and it was full of that kind of dialogue where you had to explain to the listener what was going on.
Yeah.
Nobody ever, in any film you've ever seen, gangsters, you have never ever heard a character say, "My God, he's got a gun," you know, because somebody draws a gun and they scream or they shoot or whatever happens. But nobody says, "This is a gun and I'm not afraid to use it."
Right.
So the problem with radio is, how do you know? How do you know that somebody is, in that case, drawing a gun or unsheathing a sword? Well, you can hear the sound of it, you know, maybe, but nobody in the real world would say, if they were approaching the Golden Hall on horseback, "Before you see the great house of Theoden King," you wouldn't be doing it. You would just be there and do
just go. Yeah.
So the problem with which we had a narrator to help with, which was a great help, but just finding those moments where something dramatic happens, like, for example, I mean, having mentioned Theoden, the moment at the Golden Hall where Gandalf, who's of course not given up his staff, saying it's his walking stick and so on, then subdues and unpowers Gimli, Grima. That moment, how do you show that dramatically when you can only hear it? You know, visual moment. So all visual moments. That's why I said I was so scared of the idea of battles, because a battle on radio, unless you've got something to hold it together, that is not just people banging things against something else, you know, saucepan lids, whatever, you know, because they weren't using real armor, obviously. And you can have the sound of galloping horses, and neighing, but, you know, what do? You're having people going, "Oh my God, I've been hit," you know, or you just can't do it. So you have to find ways around it, and it's a great challenge. There's a wonderful sequence that I love in the radio version, because I didn't know how we were going to resolve it, and Michael Bakewell resolved it himself for me, which was brilliant, which is Theoden's ride. And he took Forth Rode the King, and it was set to music, and it became a kind of running motif through that sequence, with battle scenes and bits of dialogue interspersed, but with this, as though a ballad, as if a balladeer was telling the tale to you.
Right.
He had to write some mock Tolkien because there weren't quite enough verses to cover what he needed to. So he wrote more verses, which I don't think many people actually spotted, which is shows how well he did it.
Yeah.
So there were moments, and we were lucky that we had a great composer, a guy called Stephen Oliver, who wrote a musical score. The BBC aimed very high, and they were wanting someone like Sir William Walton, you know, a really noted composer. And they all turned down. But I had, years before, a friend of mine, well, who will be known by name to many Tolkien inklings people, a guy called Roger Lansing Green, who was a friend of both Tolkien and Lewis, and C.S. Lewis's first biographer, had staged at his family home an open-air production of Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Oh, yeah.
And Stephen Oliver was a young student, and he commissioned him to write a score for it. And it was a beautiful score. And much of the orchestral music was very kind of pastoral and elegiac. And I just thought this man could do it. So
Yeah.
I let the record to the producer. And as a result, Stephen Oliver got the gig, and he wrote this amazing musical score. So we use music a lot. So, for example, when Gandalf gets Shadowfax, and he sees Shadowfax and calls to him, and then he wrote a piece of music which was the Shadowfax theme, and it really didn't need very much other than a small amount of dialogue from Michael Hordern as Gandalf, and the sound of hooves and this music, which sprung up like a kind of musical kind of motif, which had all the kind of lightness and urgency of a galloping horse. So, we were lucky. We had lots of ancillary things that we could do. We didn't have to say this sword in my left hand is sharp. Yeah, it's a real problem. Those are real problems. And sound effects. One thing I have a very vivid memory. We had Tolkien says that when they know Sam and Frodo know they're being pursued, and they don't yet know that it's Gollum, but they hear this kind of flapping sound echoing down the corridors and of stone. And how do we create that sound? What do we do? So they created all kinds of sounds. And I remember they had a paddling pool, an inflatable paddling pool. And they mushed up loads and loads of newspaper. So it was like a mass of papier-mâché wet. And people slopped about in it. It didn't sound right. It just sounded like somebody wading through a puddle or something, And there was a sound effects, a girl who worked there. There's a thing called spot effects, which is where like somebody is going to hit something with a sword against a shield. So, the actor's got the script, so they've got to read the script. But this sound effects person will be ready for the cue to strike it near the microphone that the actor's on, so it still sounds like it must be with that actor.
Yeah.
On several occasions, Michael Hordern didn't smoke, and I was standing behind him lighting. I was a pipe smoker in those days, lighting my pipe to recreate the sound of a pipe being lit. Anyway, this particular sound effect girl was a substantial lass. She had a long kind of caftan tie-dye dress on, and we didn't know what she was doing until we saw on camera, because there's always a camera in the studio, what she was doing. But she oinked up her dress and started slapping her thighs, and that became the sound of Gollum's footsteps. So, but for me now, whenever I hear that scene, I can't see Gollum. All I see is this lovely sound effects girl sitting there with her dress up, slapping her thighs to make the sound of the footsteps. So, the bizarre things, really, in many ways. But you find ways of working around things. I think the difficulty really, though, was the pressure, because we did these episodes back to back to back, half a day rehearse, then a day to record. Then so you'd finish recording an episode, and then the afternoon you would rehearse the next day, and the next day you'd record that episode, and then the following morning you'd do half a day's rehearsal, half a day record, finish it the next day, rehearse the next day. It was exhausting. It was winter time. Everybody got flus and colds. Everybody was sick and getting sick and making each other sick. The director got incredibly angry with me because I became such a nuisance in pointing out things that were wrong. And, I would say, but it's not right. The line's not right. And she would say, oh, for God's sake, we've done it 3 times and it sounds good. Leave it alone. And eventually I was banned from the studio. Years since I learned my lesson. And whenever I attend a recording now as the adapter writer, I sit very quietly, and I'll wait until my opinion is sought. But then I couldn't resist, and so I was sent to the green room, which was upstairs actually, and I could see the actors through the glass window looking down on the studio. But it meant that if something was wrong, I had to run all the way down the stairs to the studio to point it out, which limited the number of times that I butted in. I'm probably glad to say. So it was stressful, and not always happy. Not all the actors got on with each other, as is the way. And everybody, it was a very, very hard slog. And I was interested that Ian Holm later in his autobiography said something like it was incredibly uphill work. And yet, I mean, he embraced the part totally, but, he found it hard. And those other actors, particularly those who didn't really understand what the heck was going on, were totally mystified by it and found it really stressful. There's a nice actor called John LeMessurier. Do you have Dad's Army in America? Do you know the TV comedy Dad's Army? It's about the Home Guard in Britain. Very popular in Britain. And one of the actors there is an actor called John LeMessurier, and he played the old Bilbo in the series.
Right.
And, I came across a reference to the series in his autobiography, or rather his wife's biography of him, but she quoted a letter that he wrote to another old actor friend of his. And he said, "I'm doing this thing called The Lord of the Rings at the moment. I've no idea what it's about. But it's jolly fun because I'm working with a lot of old friends like Michael Hordern," and he mentioned a couple of other actors. So, not all the cast were necessarily totally aware of what was going on. But if you're a good instinctive actor, there are times when I think if an actor is really good, you don't necessarily need it's a terrible thing to say, perhaps, but you don't necessarily need a cerebral understanding of the part if you just embody it, which is what good actors do. One of the actors in the series, Peter Woodthorpe, was in the first English version of Waiting for Godot, and along with another close friend of mine, now also deceased, Peter Bull, and both of them would tell me of the rehearsals for that difficult, inscrutable play, and how they were rehearsing it, and none of them really understood what it was about.
Yeah.
On one occasion, Peter Brook, a great theatre director who was directing this first English language production of Beckett's play, they were asking him, what's this about? What are they waiting for? Who is Godot? And Peter Brook said to them, "Look, loves, we've only got 3 weeks till we open. Don't let's start thinking about what it means, or we will never get it done." And Peter Brook became, not Peter Brook, I'm misblaming a totally innocent director. It's Peter Hall. Peter Hall, who later became the head of the National Theatre. Peter Hall was just willing to say, "We don't know what it's about. Don't let's worry about it. Let's just learn the lines and say it." There's something of that, I think, in our version of The Lord of the Rings.
So do you have a favorite part or a favorite scene from the audio drama? I know I'll mention I really enjoy the Bill Nighy's when he sings In Western Lands. Yeah.
That is beautiful. Not one of my episodes, but I love it, and his performance of that. I mean, the vulnerability of singing it, of course, without music. I mean, the music was written by Stephen Oliver, but he had to learn it and sing it, and it's just, it is just perfect. I have two scenes I'd pick, both my own, not because I've already mentioned the Battle of Blenheim Fields and Theoden's ride at Helm's Deep. I would rate as being probably two of my favorite Michael Bakewell episodes. I suppose the two that I wrote that I'm most fond of is the second episode, which is called The Shadow of the Past, which is just intense dialogue, which is just, the back history of the ring.
Yeah.
And Gandalf, it's all the burdens all on Gandalf. He has to tell Frodo so much information. I mean, it's laden with stuff that you need to know. Yeah. There's a very funny piece on YouTube, which well, it's not funny, but it's intriguing, where somebody has put up that sequence, that conversation between Frodo and Gandalf, which is visually Elijah Wood and Ian McKellen, but the soundtrack is Ian Holm as Frodo and Michael Hordern as Gandalf, and they play the radio version against the visual, and it's fascinating. It's worth looking up because it's just such a curiosity. You look at it and you think that is the scene, and yet it's actually completely different actors reading it.
Yeah.
And ironically, of course, the person speaking for Frodo is in that film.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, why Ian was asked to play Bilbo, because Peter really wanted to have Ian somewhere in that film, as an acknowledgement of the fact that he had been the Frodo that he'd grown up listening to.
Yeah.
And that synchronicity to me. The first time I arrived in Wellington, first visit, went to Weta Workshop. I arrived in the morning, and the receptionist said, "Oh, just go up the stairs. There's somebody up there will take you to meet Richard Taylor." And I started walking up the stairs, and the music from the radio version was playing somewhere above. And I walked into what was one of the workshops, where now a great friend of mine, Gino Acevedo, was working on the maquette for the face of the scary Bilbo.
Oh, yeah.
Rivendell, where he suddenly goes like, he was making the model for that. And he was listening on a cassette player, or it was probably a CD player, on his desk to the radio Lord of the Rings. He didn't know it was right. He didn't know it was coming. And that was, to me, was a sort of really amazing moment of synchronicity, like walking into this extraordinary place where they were making all these fantastic creations. I mean, a group of people of such blinding talent as, I just loved every moment I was in the company of those creative people. And had developed a great friendship with them. I mean, Gino amongst them, but Richard and Tanya and all of the sculptors and painters and model makers. I just loved what they did. And for me, although of course I went back later to chronicle the Hobbit movies,
right,
it wasn't the same, because I remember going into a studio and seeing the model of Minas Tirith. This they normally they call them miniatures, of course, but because it was so huge,
right,
they called them bigatures. You probably knew that. But so there was this bigature of Minas Tirith, and I was just utterly blown away, as I was with Helm's Deep, which they also created, of just the intricacy and the detailing. And they had to be detailed, because the camera on Minas Tirith, when the Nazgul were flying around and so on, the camera, which was going to shoot the scene, had to be able to get in close. You had to be able to see every little building and terrace and stairway and so on. And it was just the most amazing thing. Yeah. And for me, what the later films lack is the fact that it was now possible digitally to create those environments. And they lacked something of the, I don't know what it is. I mean, you can't call it reality because it's a model, but something which feels real, even though it is a model.
Feels tangible. Yeah.
It's like, for me, the difference between, you may know, I've also written books about the work of Aardman Studio, three-dimensional stop motion animation. And I love the fact that when you're looking at the early Wallace and Gromits and Chicken Run and so on, that on the figures, the plasticine figures, you can see the imprint of the animator. It's like exactly like in it. It's not exactly like, because one's a model and the other's drawn, but it's very similar to the effect that you have with excellent line animation, because what you've got is something which actually, although it's a still photo that then becomes a series of moving pictures, although it's a still photo of a second in time, it has on it the imprints of the maker. And I always felt that the miniatures and miniatures of Lord of the Rings were such a vital part of the creation of the atmospheres. And however brilliantly the CGI was done later for The Hobbit, for me, it didn't have that same intimacy. And the work, I mean, the work of Weta Workshop is just a miracle. And I think, you know, they, like Jackson, their experience had been quite limited in what they'd had to do, but what they'd done before. You know, I mean, they created some great schlock horror effects and things, but they hadn't been called upon. And I hope it's not arrogant to identify with this myself, but it rather like I felt when I, without knowing how I was going to do it quite, stepped up to the challenge of turning this book into 26 episodes of radio drama and writing half of it and working closely on it. They just stepped up to do what they were going to do. And they suddenly found they had all these talents. You know, it's like, it was, to me, it was revelatory to go there and meet them. And their humility about what they were doing, their kind of absolute lack of the arrogance that you would have found if you were talking probably to a similar unit in a Hollywood studio, which had been making, you know, fine models and backgrounds and stuff for years and years and years. It was a voyage of discovery. I mean, that's what I liked most about the Lord of the Rings film series, I think, was that it was itself was a journey, like the radio version. It was a journey. You know, our journey in writing the radio version lasted for, well, I suppose it was a year and a half in total or something, from the concept to breaking it down to writing the scripts to rehearsing to recording. And it felt like a journey. That itself felt like a journey. And I think the filming of the Lord of the Rings was itself another journey for those people, you know, that they all traveled. And that's why the actors all became their own real true life fellowship. And true too of all the craftspeople and the, you know, the hair designers and the makeup artists. All of them became their own kind of army of friends and colleagues, which of course most film production companies you don't have the chance to do, because you make a movie and then you move on and make another movie. And these guys were all locked into making a movie for several years, and that, I think that sense of fellowship really shows in that films. But, you know, I think of the book as one book, not three. You know, as everybody knows, it was never intended to be a trilogy. Tolkien wanted it to be a book, and it was financial considerations that led the publishers to chop it up into 3 parts. So I always think of it as a book, not a trilogy. I mean, it's so amusing that if you think of not just how people think of it as a trilogy, but also the fact that all those other writers since, well, certainly around the time, were churning out trilogies. You know, you couldn't write a fantasy novel. You had to write 3 because it had to be a trilogy, because that's what you did. You know, if only they'd known, they could have just got away with writing 1, you know, Guy Gavriel Kay and people like that. So interesting. But I think of it as one film, really, even though it is 3 films. And it is a real journey. And of course, for the viewer, like the listener, you travel that journey. And the book, I mean, let's face it, at the end of the book, when Sam says, "Well, I'm back," you have completed, you know, your journey. And I know fans who are reader fans who, at that point, just go back to page 1 and start again.
Yeah, it's definitely bittersweet when you get to those lines of Sam's. Sorry, I'm getting a little echo there. We'll back up just a little bit. You mentioned, you know, obviously you've visited set there in New Zealand. What was your first reaction when you heard they were going to be making films based on Lord of the Rings, having adapted it for radio yourself and knowing probably better than most the unique challenges of adapting, you know, and you had 13 hours to do it. which I guess, theatrical versions are about 9 with the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, they're even dealing with less runtime. So what was your reaction, kind of having an inside knowledge of the challenges of adapting Tolkien?
Well, obviously, yeah. What are they going to do with it? I suppose. I mean, I have vivid memories of seeing the Bakshi film in the cinema and being confused by a lot of it, even though I knew the book by then. I mean, I was really puzzled at why Saruman was sometimes called Saruman and sometimes called Aruman.
Aruman.
And why was that? I'm totally inexplicable. I did, however, adore, and I don't think I shamelessly stole, but certainly modeled my opening to the very first episode on Bakshi's silhouetted history of the ring, which is still, to me, I remember it as being like a powerful piece of imagery, and I thought it was fantastic. When it came to the radio version, I have to say it went through, I don't know how many permutations. I mean, I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. How can you simply tell this story? How can you whittle it down to enough information to give the reader, the listener rather, a concept of what is to come? And Christopher Tolkien saw the scripts and he was very helpful. And we did come up with a kind of a narrated version to tell where we are, ending with the ring still being sought for by the Lord of the Rings, and then we went into the opening music. So there was like a prologue to the series, and I was very fortunate because the year before, 1980, the Unfinished Tales had been published, and in it was the account of the hunt for Gollum. And I instinctively thought, I'm going to use that. I had to seek permission because it was not in the package of rights that had been bought, but Christopher Tolkien was fine about it. So we were able to come out of that opening montage before we went to Hobbit and then all the rustic kind of peasantry kind of nonsense and stuff. Before that, we had this scene where the riders are searching for, they're searching for the ring, and they stumble on Gollum and they take him to Barad-dûr, as is recorded in Unfinished Tales, and he is tortured there and reveals all he can remember, which is the Shire and Bagginses and Hobbitses. And so, it meant that I was able to establish Gollum right at the beginning of the series, before, long before we ever get to hear him, because we don't really hear him until, the first appearance of him is, of course, when they're on the River Anduin, following the boat. But there've been odd flapping noises and things in Moria, but nothing tangible. So I was able to establish him several episodes before he made his actual appearance. But I did kind of, the two things were kind of doubts in my mind about the film version. One was because the moment I heard, I looked to see what Peter Jackson had done, and my first reaction, I have to say, was, I don't think this man can possibly do this. I mean, I saw bad taste, and I thought, I don't know. And I just thought that, why have they chosen this person? Which, of course, is probably what most of the movie industry thought as well.
Yeah.
But there was a very memorable day. I was, myself and a friend of mine, Jane Johnson, who writes as, now I've forgotten her pen name, Jude Fisher. Jane Johnson and I, along with the people from HarperCollins, were invited to a screening of just a taster of footage, and we all had to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. We all went in wondering what it was going to be, and it was basically there were a few bits and pieces, but essentially what I remember most visibly from it were the scenes of the Black Riders and the hobbits sheltering underneath the tree roots, and then chase to the ford, which was part of what they also showed, with the raft going off and the Black Riders coming to the end of the pier and stopping. And I can't remember quite else what was in it, but it was all, I mean, the stuff of Gandalf's arrival, I think, was in there. And Jane and I walked out of the theatre, and we were kind of, well, I can't say numb, really. We were taken, we were stunned is what we were. And both of us looked at each other and said, it's going to work. You know, I think we both just instinctively knew, we both knew the world very well, because Jane had been Tolkien editor at HarperCollins. And, you know, she was the person who had managed to get the first illustrated version of The Lord of the Rings, illustrated by Alan Lee, accepted by the estate. I mean, she knew the books and was herself a writer of fantasy. So, you know, we both knew the territory really well. And we both looked at each other, and I think instinctively we just knew this is going to work. So then I didn't have any worries. By that point, we'd both she and I had both been signed up to do tie-in books, which was, you know, a delight. I remember seeing, I'd worked with John Howe on the map books by that time, and I remember seeing a bit of footage. This was part of the Peter Jackson pitch. I don't know whether we were shown it then or some other time. I can't remember. But anyway, it was what he had prepared to sell to New Line, the concepts. And essentially, it was him talking about what he was going to do and so on. And there were a lot of panning shots across piles of books, you know, Shippey's Road to Middle-earth and the original Atlas to Middle-earth and things like that. And there, in the middle of this display that they were panning across, were my books with John, the original fold maps, paper covered. And it felt just like, oh my word, we're already part of this story, you know. And I remember John Howe saying to me, I mean, he was very gracious to say it was our front door, but because he'd drawn it, I hadn't. But the painting of inside Bag End with the door open, which was the cover of the first of the map books, and would later be in that combined one with the hole cut out so you could see the book inside. He said when he was working on it, I think he showed me a piece of the concept art for the Hobbiton scenes, and he said, that's our door. And, you know, I always felt I had some small, very, very small bit of ownership in the film, you know, not more than that. But the real excitement, I think, for Jane and I was we were invited to, there was a huge press launch in Cannes when really it was the Mines of Moria sequence that was shown, plus some early stuff of Gandalf, so it didn't all look too dark and sinister. And we went to the screening of that. I think it was 20-25 minutes, something like that. And this theatre, which was full of press people who are not apt to go mad about movies, to be honest, erupted. I mean, it just erupted. I think it was, if I'm right, I may have got this wrong, but I think that the cinema it was shown at, which was called the Olympia, I think, was the theatre where years before at the Cannes Film Festival they'd shown Bad Taste. I think it was Bad Taste they showed there, or I don't know, or Frighteners or whatever it was. But anyway, whatever the film was that was shown there. And, you know, one of their early films, which was a real renegade production, was shown here. And now what was being shown there was this taster for a film that was going to be the biggest kind of, you know, amazing film. Everybody was already saying. And that evening, the studio had hired a chateau just outside of Cannes. And we all went to this fantastic party. I've never been to anything like it in my life before or since, where the whole of the grounds of this chateau had been transformed into parts of Middle-earth. There was one of the trolls under the trees. I mean, you know, huge, towering. They'd built a hobbit hole that you could actually go into and walk around. The interior of the castle had been turned into Theoden's Hall with the throne and the banners, and it was just extraordinary. and lots of funny things too. So there was a replica of the Prancing Pony where you went to get your drinks, and it was built at human size, and we were all then reduced to hobbit size.
Hobbit size.
The bar was way up there, and they had very tall actors standing on boxes or stilts behind the bar, so they towered above you to serve you. And I remember that they had portaloos, you know, for conveniences for people to use, and they just looked like regular portaloos. But when you went in it, unsuspecting, there was just gentle music playing, and then suddenly there'd be the charge of the Rohirrim. So you're in this cubicle with thundering horses and screaming and clashing armors. It was an amazing event, and Jane and I were hugely privileged because we were given kind of access all parts because we were writing our books, and there was a green room set aside in the chateau for the cast, so they could escape from the interviews and all the rest of it. And we we cohabited their green room, which was fantastic. And I remember taking the proofs of the first of my books, because the first book about the Lord of the Rings that Jane and I wrote were written before we'd seen anything. You know, we had to write it over the winter of 2000 so that it was ready to go for publication in 2001.
Yeah.
So we had texts of what are called EPKs, which are electronic press kits, which is interviews that they had done with the cast members. We given access to all of that, and lots of pictures and stuff. So much of what we did was built on nothing, frankly, the first book. But I remember taking the proofs with me, and one of the things we'd done was to, in my book, in order to occupy as many pages as possible, there's so little to go with, was a whole page portrait of all the fellowship, all 9 of them, with facing it a page about the actor who was playing it. So there was a sort of major portrait picture, and then facing it, there was a piece about Sir Ian McKellen and Sir Ian Holm and so on. And we took the proofs with us of our first book so that the cast members could just check it for veracity, quoting them. And I remember it was wasn't my first encounter with Christopher Lee. If you remind me, I'll tell you about that. But it was a memorable encounter with him because I'd written about Christopher Lee's, and of course, you know, the most filmed actor ever. And I had talked about his roles, many roles, but of course, inevitably had talked about Dracula.
Right.
And I remember sitting there with him. Everybody else just read their piece. Sean Bean and Vigo, they all read their piece and signed off on it. It was fine. But of course, when I got to Christopher, he's reading it. He's going, "Now, just a moment. I don't think I ever played Dracula in as many as 8 movies." Like, whatever it was. So I said, "Oh, I think you did. I think you did, Christopher," or Mr. Lee, I probably said then. And he said, "Well, did I? Well, even if I did, I don't think we need to mention all of those." He always he amused me so much because he was, you know, he was. I mean, he was such a brilliant actor, and I loved him, and I loved his work, but he was so self-obsessed. You know, he was so full of himself is a demeaning term. I don't really mean that, but he was so aware of his own presence, and he couldn't grasp the fact that playing Dracula had been the thing that had made him known throughout the world and loved throughout the world. You know, and this enables me to tell you the story of how my first ever meeting with him. Because I want to draw the contrast between him and between Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, because they were so often linked in movies.
Yeah.
I were friends. And I first met Christopher Lee in the company of Peter Cushing when I was a young man, many, many years before any of all this stuff ever happened. I was trying to write a book about actors, book of profiles. And I approached lots of people I knew or people who were friends of people I knew. And somehow or other, I wrote to Peter Cushing, who turned out to be an absolute sweetie. I mean, a real beautiful person. And he wrote back and said, oh, yes, please come. I'd love to meet you and be interviewed. Come down to Pinewood, where he was filming, Pinewood Studio in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And I went down, and he was making a film. I should have checked this before I started telling the story. I think it was called something like Nothing But the Night or something like that. It was a Hammer horror film, not a kind of Dracula, Frankenstein horror film, but it was set in a hospital, and the Cushing and Lee were both medics, surgeons, I think. And Dinah Dawes was the leading lady in it. So I was introduced to by Peter Cushing, who was an absolute gent and treated me beautifully, took me around the studio, took me to lunch in the commissary, showed me all behind the sets, how you could be in a kind of Peruvian high street, and then you go through and you're in a Cornish village square on the other side.
Yeah.
And really looked after me and gave me a wonderful time. For me, it was just like, it was magic. I was in a film studio watching actors act and so on. And all the bits I picked up on so many things, like Cushing was a chain smoker and always wore a white glove on his right hand when he was smoking, so that he didn't nicotine stain his fingers, because he smoked non-filter cigarettes. And how he had this guy who stood in for him. I'd never understood about stand-ins at all until I was there. And Peter would be sitting in his, canvas back chair, the way you see with the name on the back, and there would be his stand-in standing on there while they measured the length of the vocal vocal length of the camera and lens and so on. Focal length, not focal. Focal length of the lens. And then when they were all happy, ready to go, Paddy, his name was, he stepped out of the frame, and Peter got up, took off his white gloves, stepped in and did the scene. All that was a revelation to me, but he was lovely. And he gave me a long interview in his dressing room after the filming was over. And I remember being utterly intrigued by the fact that he took off his wig, because he had this, as you know, this sort of widow's peak here. And, he took off the wig, and he was quite, very hair, much receding, and then put on his personal wig, which was not quite as developed, was thinning, but he still wore a little wig. Anyway, he was lovely to me. And I remember at the end of the interview, I said, thank you very much. And he said, and now, dear boy, how are you getting home? Where do you live? I said, I live outside of London in Kent. Oh, my goodness, that's a long way. So you go into London first? I said, yes, I do. Well, he said, how are you going to do that? I said, oh, by underground. No, that's not thinkable, dear boy. No, Paddy and I will drive you into London, and you can get your train. So I had this, God help me, I cannot remember a thing about the conversation. I drove from Pinewood Studios, I'm probably 45 minutes or an hour, I don't know, from out in the country into the centre of London, sitting in the back of this, I don't know what it was, but, chauffeur-driven car. Paddy, the stand-in, was also his chauffeur, with Peter Cushing. And I heaven help me, I can't remember what we talked about, but anyway, magic. So fast forward a few months, maybe a year, I don't know. And my best friend and I have gone to the BAFTAs. The BAFTAs in those days was quite a low-key event, and it was held at the National Film Theatre in London. And my mate and I hired our DJs from the hire shop and rocked up to this. We bought a ticket. You could do that in those days. And we go to sit down, and lo and behold, I realize I'm sitting behind Christopher Lee. So wanting to be a bit swanky and showy off to my chum, when the BAFTA thing was over and everybody started getting up, I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and I said, Christopher Lee? And he said, yes. And I said, I don't suppose you'll remember me. And he said, no. I thought, well, I've got to try and explain now, because my friend is looking at me like, well, yeah, you really know this man? Of course you don't know it. So I said, well, I met you on the set of whatever the film was called, with Peter Cushing. And he said, did you? So, I'm now lost completely. I've got nothing left to say. What can you say? He doesn't remember me. He's obviously not going to engage with me. And so I said, in desperation, I said, how is Peter? And he looked at me, completely withering look, and he said, "We don't live together, you know." And walked away, and that was it. Years later, when working on the films, I took him to lunch. I was then a member of a London club, and I took him to the club for lunch, and I reminded him of it, and he was, I have to say, appalled that he said, "Oh my God, I can't imagine I did that to you." Whereas Peter Cushing, who I interviewed several more times when he was writing his autobiographies, I just adored Peter's attitude to his fame. You know, for Peter, he absolutely. I mean, Peter Cushing was a fine actor. There's not a lot of evidence of it. Sorry, that's not fair. But I mean, I'm talking about his non-horror acting. There's not a lot of examples of it. Obviously, there's Star Wars, but you know, as a stage actor, he was much revered and much praised. You get a glimpse of him playing Osric in the duel scene at the end of Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, where he plays the part he'd played on stage, in fact. And he's fantastic. He's absolutely fantastic in it. And there's one or two films he made which are straight films. They're not Hot Hammer, which show how good he was. And there's I think it's on, you can find it on YouTube, the BBC version of 1984, in which he played Winston Smith, which was an exceptional performance. And he played Mr. Darcy for the BBC, but much of this archive stuff doesn't exist anymore because telly was live, and you know, it wasn't preserved, it wasn't recorded. So you either saw it or you missed it. That's how it was. But he, nevertheless, despite his real acting chops and how good he was, he just accepted the fact that this notoriety that he'd achieved through the Dracula and Frankenstein movies and the other Hammer films that he was in, he accepted that and embraced it. And he was gracious to his fans, always. You know, you would never have heard Peter Cushing saying, "I didn't make X many versions of Dracula or Frankenstein," because that was fine. You know, that was fine. Whereas Christopher, who never had, I don't think, the opportunities really to display either on the stage or on film his many examples to display his straight acting. I mean, obviously, there's the Bond film and one or two other things he did, but basically he was locked into that persona and somehow was unhappy with it. You know, But I'll tell you just, are we okay? We're still talking. Is this all right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you just two things about Christopher subsequently, and I say we became good friends. Well, if you could become good friends, Christopher. One of them was at the premiere of The Two Towers in Paris, when I was invited to. I'm trying to think whose birthday it was. Young Mr. Monaghan's, I think it was. And the whole all the cast were there, and we were sitting around the table, and I was seated with, on one side of me, Richard Taylor, who by then I was good friends with, and on the other side of me was Christopher and his wife Geeta. And the conversation, I mean, it's great. I mean, I could see in awe. I was sitting opposite Liv Tyler, who I hadn't previously met because she'd filmed all the stuff that she'd done for the film long before I got involved with it. But Viggo was there, and all the Hobbits and Ian and so on. It was a fantastic evening, hosted by Barry Osborne. But I didn't know it's hosted by Barry Osborne, so I was slightly anxious about being a very chic French restaurant. I'd been invited, but I didn't know whether we were paying our own way. So I was slightly anxious because I'd gone to Paris for this premiere, but wasn't carrying, masses of euros with me. We're sitting there, and my mate Richard Taylor, we'd been running around comic shops most of the day in Paris, and Richard suddenly said to me, "Brian, where do you get these euros from?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean, Richard?" And he said, "Well, I've only got New Zealand dollars." And I said, well, Richard, you're staying at the Four Seasons Hotel. Just ask the concierge. They'll change your New Zealand dollars for euros. And he went, oh, really? I mean, like, you know, but I mean, he really hadn't ever been, you know, outside. I mean, and what I loved about Richard was that he never, and Peter too, actually, that they never lost that innocence of what they were, really, even with all the success that came. I remember later having breakfast at the Dorchester in London with Richard Taylor, where we had breakfast with his 2 Oscars on the breakfast table. He couldn't bear to leave them in the room. He had to bring them down and put them on the table in the breakfast room. But so there's Richard, doesn't know about euros, and bless him. So he said, well, I haven't got any euros tonight. If we have to pay for this meal, could you help me out? And, you know, I'll settle up with you tomorrow. So I said, yeah, okay, Richard, thinking, oh my God, I've got to pay for my meal. And then the meal wore on, and just before the speeches started, I think Christopher got wind of the fact that there were going to be, you know, speeches and stuff. So he leant over to me and he whispered, and he said, Gita and I are terribly tired, and I really need to get my sleep because tomorrow's going to be an exhausting day, and so we need to retire. So be a decent guy, will you, and just pick up my tab this evening, and I'll settle with you tomorrow. So there I am sitting there thinking, I'm now paying for 4 dinners in this expensive French restaurant. Well, I wasn't, because Barry Osborne, the producer, picked up the tab and nobody paid. But when my biography of Peter came out, I was sitting with my husband, David, in the local pub, having a drink, enjoying a pub lunch. And the phone rang, and I picked it up, and a voice said, is that Brian Sibley? And I said, Christopher, how are you? And he said, how did you know it was me? And I said, I mean, like, how do you know it's Christopher Lee? I mean, right. Like, he said, I was disguising my voice. And I thought, well, not terrible. So he said, I've just been reading this book of yours about Peter. Very good, very good. I said, oh, thank you. He said, yes, but there's something I'd like to clarify. Now, when, as you know, Saruman gets bumped off actually in the Two Towers rather than in the Scouring of the Shire, there's a famous sequence as described by Peter. He's described it in several places, which is where when Grima when Brad Dourif stabs Saruman in the back, Peter had said to Christopher, cry out, scream out, and then you're going to plunge to your death. And Christopher had said to Peter, no, Peter, no. Nobody who's stabbed in the back ever screams out. They can only exhale because the shock is so great. They never scream. And I know this because I was a member of the SAS. And Peter had gaily told me this story, and I'd put it in the book. So now I've got Christopher on the phone. Now, this incident about the SAS business that Peter told you about, it's not accurate, actually, because I wasn't in the SAS. I was in the SAS Reserve. So I said, oh dear, I'm sorry, maybe I can correct it in a later edition. No, you don't need to correct it. It's just that I don't want you to be under any, misunderstanding about what the truth was. And I have spoken this morning to the head of the SAS and explained the situation to him, in case he happens to read the book and, concerned about it. But I don't think you need to do anything exactly. But, I just wanted you to know. So I said, oh, okay. Anyway, he then steamed on, talking away. I'm very conscious that my battery and my phone is on the blink and probably going to run out. And he had just been not filming, as it turned out, Sweeney Todd for Tim Burton.
Oh, right.
And he said, I'm appalled. I'm appalled. I should have been in the third Lord of the Rings film. And I was cut out of it by having this absurd death of Saruman in the second part, which was not where I should have died at all. And now I've had the indignity of filming Sweeney Todd, and I've now been cut out of that. So I said, oh, really? He said, yes, absolutely. I mean, I was the chorus. Now, Sweeney Todd, the opera musical, opens, Stephen Sondheim wrote a kind of chorus, really, and all the people are singing together. Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd, his face was red and his eye was odd. So he said, rather than have a chorus, I was there, a spotlight, dark, completely black. A spotlight illumines me from above. And I start singing, attend the tale of Sweeney Todd, his face was like... And I'm sitting there thinking, my God, I've got Christopher Lee singing Stephen Sondheim on my mobile phone. I can't believe it. Anyway, the conversation went on and on and on. And I'm on the point, we were now walking home from the pub to where we live. And I'm trying to bring the conversation to an end before the battery runs out.
Right.
I said, I've really got to go, Christopher. I'm sorry, but the battery is going. He said, oh, right, okay. Well, I just want to say one thing to you. He had told me earlier to this a rather racy story about somebody connected with the film. My lips are sealed. So just as we're parting, he said, I just want to say that story I mentioned to you about so-and-so earlier, if you ever tell anybody about it, then there will be some very severe repercussions. I wasn't a member of the SAS as such, but I have many good friends who are still members of the SAS. And I just had this vision, of suddenly men in balaclavas and dressed in black would be leaping out from the hedges and grabbing hold of me and dragging me off somewhere to be interrogated. But, I loved him because he was so larger than life and amazing. And for the bonus discs of the DVDs of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, actually, I interviewed him many times in London. You don't see me interviewing him, but I'm asking the questions that are then used for the cut-ins. And he was always difficult. One day he showed up and said, now, I'm not spending another 2 hours on this interview today, Brian. I want you to understand. Gita has said to me, you cannot do it. Do you know how old I am? I mean, I'm not a young man. I mean, energy, I'm very fit, but I'm not young. And I get very tired. So I'm not doing more than an hour today. So I said, oh, very well, that's fine. Thanks for the clarity, Christopher. We go into the room in the hotel where we're filming, and I say to the crew, now look, Christopher can only do an hour today, so please, we need to focus. We do everything quickly and give Christopher time to go home. Yeah, thank you very much. So we start recording. And Michael Pellerin, who was the person who responsible for all those bonus DVDs, always gave me more than enough possible questions. So sheaves of questions. So I'm talking to Christopher and I'm getting on and I'm keeping an eye on my watch. And we get to a moment we're really running down and we finally hit the hour mark. And I say, well, Christopher, thank you. That was fine. That's fine, everybody. That was a take. Stand down. Christopher's got to, we must get Christopher his car and he's got to go. And he went, well, I haven't mentioned anything about, something else that I wanted to talk about. There's that whole sequence, the Council of Elrond and the White Council, rather, that scene. I wanted to talk about that. And I said, well, Christopher, we've run the hour. Yes, well, all right. Well, let's just do a little more. And of course, a little more led on to another hour. And then we closed down and he still stood talking to the crew and the camera. I remember working with a cameraman. So he was quite impossible. And I'm sure he got home and then Gita said, that's another 2.5 hours. And he said, yes, well, it's that man, Sibley. I'm sure I got the blame. But I loved him for, just for his wonderful eccentricity, really.
Yeah, we actually, I spoke with Ian Nathan, who wrote the Peter Jackson book, Anything You Can Imagine, and he told me a story on here about Christopher Lee where Christopher Lee mistook him for catering while he was on a set visit. Definitely a larger than life figure for sure.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So you mentioned briefly we talked about your map books with John Howe and your the official movie guides that you did for all the Middle Earth films, and then you briefly touched on that you also wrote a biography for Peter Jackson. So what was that process like?
Difficult, to be honest. Peter, because he was doing so much, was very elusive, and it was quite hard to pin him down. There was an unofficial biography by a writer called Ian Pryor, who had worked with Peter, but the relationship was not what it had been. And he was very unhappy that there was going to be this unofficial biography coming out of him. And I think I've never discussed this with him or Fran, actually, but I suspect that the conversation in the Jackson household went something like, well, why don't you get Brian to do it? Because, he's sympathetic to you and the project and all of Tolkien and everything. So maybe you should ask him. But anyway, yes, I was asked to do it. And it's why I only wrote 2 books about the Lord of the Rings, as opposed to the 3 that I was commissioned to write, because I was then deep in trying to write this biography. So it was a kind of a race. Well, it wasn't a successful race because Pryor's book came out prior to mine. But it was, the 2 things I can say about it. One was it was very difficult because Peter really just didn't have the time to give me the interviews that I needed until after I'd been in New Zealand. I arrived in New Zealand and spent several days doing stuff. And then I thought I was going to see Peter. And then Peter had to fly to London to supervise the scoring of, I think it would have been probably the 2 Towers by that point, I imagine. And don't worry, Brian, I'll see you in London. We'll pick up in London. We'll do the interviews in London. When I got back from New Zealand to London, he had flown to LA for the Oscars, but we'll catch up on the way back from the Oscars, which we did briefly. But most of my interviews with him were conducted for that book, not in person, but were actually conducted down the telephone. And it was, by this time he was filming Kong. Was that right? Or was he doing pickups on the Return of the King? Probably pickups. No, it may have been Kong, actually. I'm not sure. Can't remember. So either I spoke to him at 8 o'clock in the morning, his time, when he was ready to go to the shoot or edit, whichever he was doing that day. So I had him for an hour before he went to work. Or I had him at 8 o'clock in the morning, my time, which was 8 o'clock at night, his time, when he'd just come off set or out of the editing suite. So he was always either geared up to go on whatever he was going to do, or was exhausted from what he'd just done.
Yeah.
But long, detailed phone conversations, all of which we recorded and were then transcribed and used for really what is the body of that book. What I'm happiest about the book, and I mean, it's now been superseded by another biography, of course, but what I'm happiest about it is that because I had so much material, and not just from Peter, but from all his friends, because the great asset of not having Peter to interview meant that I was able to interview, all the guys who'd worked with him on the Bad Taste movies and those early projects, who were his chums from work and so on, had known him as a kid, but also to meet with co-workers at the newspaper where he worked, school teachers, friends, just people who knew him.
Yeah.
And it gave me a really good picture of the young Peter Jackson. And also I was able to, of course, meet all those people that he worked with at Weta and get their stories about him. So, I got a lot of stuff. And then people like Barry Osborne and Mark Wadesky had all been very involved in the whole process of how the Lord of the Rings came to be made. So the film is, I think, a pretty good account of the story of how that film got to be made. There's a lot there that's I don't think anywhere else. So of course, a lot's on the DVD extras now, but I
Right.
think even Michael Pellerin was saying to me the other day, there is stuff in your book which is it's not actually on camera anywhere.
Yeah.
So that was great. It wasn't great, and this I'm not criticizing Peter for this, but it wasn't great to arrive back at the hotel I was staying in Wellington called the Duxton. And I had a really bad fall the day before. I just for the first time had very focal glasses, totally missed my step on a curve, fallen down, cut my hand open very badly. So I was all bound up like the Invisible Man or the Mummy. And I came back to my hotel only to face the only time in my life it has ever happened or will ever happen that I was doorstepped by a bunch of press guys who were waiting in the lobby. And when I came in, they didn't recognize me because they didn't know who they were looking for. But I went over to the reception desk to get my key, and the receptionist gave me my key and said, "Oh, these gentlemen are waiting to see you." And suddenly people are snapping photographs. And I'm trying to say, can I get my bandaged hand out of the way? And what's this all about? And what I didn't know was that Peter had left for London on that very day. And at the airport, he'd been asked about the fact that there was an unofficial biography coming about him.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter had said, as he was getting on the plane, "Oh, no comment. I refer you to my official biographer, Brian Sibley." So suddenly there I was with all these press people who wanted to what was happening, what was the story behind the unofficial biography, what was my book going to say. It was a nightmare. And I had no idea how to handle it. It's totally unexpected. So eventually I said, "Look, I'm sorry. I've had a very bad accident. I need to get some rest. If you come back," I had a suite. Fortunately, because I was there for such a long period of time, I had a 2-room room. So I wasn't always sitting in my bedroom, if you know what I mean, when I was working. Mm-hmm. So I had a separate room which I could use to be interviewed or interviewed. So I said, "I'll give an interview at such and such a time." And they came in and I gave my interview. And then I posed for a picture for them on the stairs of the hotel where there was a huge circular gold-rimmed mirror. So I was able to stand in it, keep the arm out of the way. And then they had a kind of rings, me in the middle of a ring, gold ring type picture to use. So that was my bit of notoriety, but it was absolutely terrifying. And of course, meant that everybody then, because it was in the paper, the Wellington paper the next day, everybody in the area who I might have spoken to, everybody knew that I was there and what I was doing. And it's a small, it's a city, but it's like a small town.
Right.
So I couldn't go anywhere without everybody. You're the guys writing the book about Peter? Yes, I am. Yes. A restaurant, can I have a beer? "Oh, you're the guys writing about Peter, aren't you?" Yeah, that's me. I always silently thank Peter for that bit of unwanted publicity. Bless him. But yeah, I mean, I'm proud of the book as it appears. By the time I'd done all the interviews, he was working on Kong. And so I was able to route the whole film around King Kong because it had been the film that had so impressed him as a kid. Yeah. And which he had wanted to make all his life and had wanted to make before he ever hit on the idea of making Lord of the Rings. He was, gunning to make a remake of King Kong. Right. Sadly, the remake, when it got made, was never, I don't know, I've never talked to him about it since, but I guess was probably not quite the film that he had in his mind that he would do. But I remember on the night of I think it was the screening in Wellington of The Two Towers, I think it must have been that, and he didn't go to the screening. This was at the Embassy Theatre. It was just a first screening for people. But I think he was expected to be there. But he wasn't there because he was at the viewing theatre in Wetton Workshop, where he was showing the original print of King Kong, which was passing through somehow. He got his hands on it and he could only got one night to show it. So he was going to watch it again. And so he had his own little party in the cinema at his own studio there to show King Kong. So while everybody was waiting and hoping to see him at the Embassy Theatre, see the Two Towers. He was, or maybe in Return of the King, whatever it was.
Yeah.
He was actually watching
King Kong.
and I was sitting about 2 or 3 rows behind him. And when it came to the bit where on the boat they're looking at the bombs that they're going to throw to stun Kong, he's suddenly holding up. He's got the 2 prop bombs there, and he's going, "These are the bombs. These are the bombs. These are the actual bombs that are used in the film." You know, and it was, for me, it was just amazing, because what I was realized was that here was a man who, you know, could have been, he probably wouldn't have enjoyed the film because he'd seen it so many times by then. He could have been watching his own movie, the adulation of the audience, who would have been adulatory, whatever, you know, whatever he thought of it. But he chose to watch his favorite film, privately, with a bunch of people from Weta and whoever else was around, like me, you know, with popcorn on supply in the foyer, so you could get popcorn and fizzy drinks. You know, that sums up so much of Peter to me. Yeah, I mean, I went back for The Hobbit, but The Hobbit was a different kettle of fish. I mean, in so many ways, kettles of fish, as it turned out. And it was different for lots of reasons. One, because, not to speak ill of Warner Brothers, but Warner Brothers did not approach the film making or those associated with the film in the same way that New Line had done. New Line made those of us, like Jane Johnson and myself, made us feel like we were part of the team. You know, we felt as though, although we were only doing, you know, ancillary publicity, putting it bluntly, we were part of what was being made, and we were treated in that way. I mean, as I say, access all parts. Nowhere is out of bounds. I could wander where I wanted, and everybody just adopted me while I was there. I could, you know, everybody looked after me, became friends, amazing relationships. And if I was ever privy to anything that was where something was not going right, I remember traveling in a car with Barry Osborne and Mark Odesky, and some rather tense conversations were going on the phone. And at the end of it, Mark Odesky turned to me and said, "You didn't hear any of that, did you?" And I said, "Hear any of what?" And he said, "Exactly." And when I got out of the car, I said, "Oh, thanks for the lift back." And we'd come from, I don't know, a location or studio set somewhere. And I got out of the car. I said, "Just to be clear, Mark, I was never in this car today." But everybody, there was absolute kind of trust and confidence between us as outsiders and part of the whole 3-ring circus of the thing itself. But with The Hobbit, it was completely different, and it was much more controlled. Those guys, New Line, were not running the show. And it was a big studio with different issues and different anxieties, I'm sure, and you know, financial and fiscal problems that were, you know, of great concern to them, with a production that's taking place thousands of miles away from where their head office is. So, you know, it was a different game altogether. But I enjoyed being there. Lovely moments. I remember Peter showing up at the studio when they were filming the party scene with the fireworks and all the rest of it, and all the Hobbit children and so on. Peter showing up in his copy of the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car, you know, the film, one of his many cars in his great collection. I mean, that was a magical moment, seeing Peter Jackson in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. And you know, I enjoyed the films, but I didn't, looking at them afterwards, I don't think I enjoyed them in the same way as I did The Lord of the Rings. And I think it was to do with the fact, I think if Guillermo del Toro had made the film, whether it would have been a film as opposed to 3 or 2, I've no idea. But if he had made The Hobbit, it would have been an immensely different film. It wouldn't have, and I think if it had been different, I don't think it would have clashed with The Lord of the Rings. I don't think it would have impinged on the Lord of the Rings. I think people would have just accepted that this is Guillermo del Toro's Hobbit, rather like Pan's Labyrinth or any other film that he made, and they would have accepted it on its own individual, unique terms. And I don't think they would have said, "Oh, well, it's not like the Lord of the Rings." I don't think they'd have said that. But the moment Peter became involved, it had to have the same look. It had to feel and look the same as the Lord of the Rings, and it gave him the opportunity, of course, to address all of those things which are on the edges, or even not even on the edges of the Hobbit. Where does Gandalf go when he abandons the dwarves and Bilbo when they're about to go into where is he? Why does he drop out of the picture? Well, of course, at the time, Tolkien was pretty mysterious about it when he was writing it.
Right.
And later, of course, did we know that he was actually going to the White Council or to go to Dol Guldur. But of course, for Peter, it was an opportunity to put all these links in, to make the connections, to make the connection with the fact that Thranduil was Legolas's father, to tie up all those knots, to get the cast back together again. Find a way, as there was at the White Council, to have Galadriel and Saruman, have Cate Blanchett and Christopher Lee there back in the studio again.
Yeah.
A chance to have Bilbo, to have Ian back as the old Bilbo, just to frame the beginning of the end of the story. So it was irresistible to him, I think. And then I think the progress that had been made with special effects, CGI stuff particularly, kind of took over the film. And he couldn't. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, he just willfully made the book into a trilogy." And my opinion, it's only an opinion, is that absolutely that was not the case. That time literally overtook him, and that there was no way that he was going to be able to finish the film beyond roughly halfway through, but by the time when he was supposed to have delivered the whole film. So it instantly became two films.
Yeah.
And the moment it became two films, I predicted that it inevitably would become three films. Some wonderful stuff in it. Some great performances.
Absolutely.
Totally magical moments. There's also a huge amount of excess in there, which I think perhaps a different team of people might have pulled back from. Do you need all those gold making, gold melting, gold rivers scenes in the Lonely Mountain? Does all that need to be there? Do you need that great battle on the ice at the end in such detail? And of course, for people for whom The Hobbit is a slight book, and it's a slight book. I mean, it's a series of little episodes, really, because in the way that he was telling and writing and telling it to his children, very episodic. And then suddenly at the end, when he has to finish it, it suddenly turns into this high narrative with language that's doesn't actually really quite match with the opening chapters at all, really. And then this slight story is even further burdened by having all this other overlay, having to link in Radagast, having to make all these connections and make them pay off, quite often at a cost of other things. I mean, I thought, for instance, that the scenes with Bjorn, which I think should have Bjorn, should have been probably more fleshed out, but time was given to Radagast and his rabbits and stuff. It's just like the thing ran away. I thought ran away with itself. I love Martin Freeman's performance. Great to see Ian again, of course. And all the dwarves. I met all those dwarves, interviewed all of them, and when I was talking to them, and I knew the amount of detail that had gone into the creation of their characters, their costumes, their props. You know, every one of them had a backstory that was,
Right.
you know, in huge detail. But of course, when the thing shook down, there wasn't time for all that detail in the film. You know, it got lost. And so there are many scenes where a lot of the dwarves are just standing there, you know, no input into the scene at all. And I thought that was a shame, really. But as I say, there's magnificence in it as well. You know, the attack on Lake Tower, it's fantastic. The dragon itself is brilliant. And you know, all of it, of course, is shot through with Alan and John's art work inspiration.
Yeah.
The I mean, I haven't said much about John or Alan, but I mean, and although he's not part of it, I also hugely admire Ted Naismith and his work.
Absolutely.
You know, so there are three artists with whom I'm happy to have a friendship that I'm really grateful for, and each of them are so different from each other. You know, if I wanted to pick a scene from Alan, I would probably pick something like his view of maybe the meeting of Gandalf and Thorin on the bridge, or his pictures of Rivendell. And if I'm going to John, then it would be Gandalf falling with the Balrog. Ice and Fire. There's a title. So you know, I love them dearly, and I love the sort of luminescence of Ted's paintings too. I mean, some of them are just breathtaking. So you know, and that the presence of Alan and John in those all six films is very strong, and it was a smart move of Peter's in the first place to book. Take on board, not just, I mean, he admired them anyway, but he took on board to style his films the two people whose work was already known and beloved by Rings fans. And you know, and so anything they created was going to look authentic,
right? It's a stroke of genius.
Well, and you know, all those little things that he did, you know, I mean, I don't know whether it's true, but the story's told that when the casts were coming, who didn't know the book, were coming from England or flying down from LA to New Zealand, that they were given the box set of the CDs of the radio version and told, if you want to know what it's about, listen to this. 13 hours, the length of your flight, you can know. And you know, he embraced having Jane and I on board as well, which made another link with people, because people were aware of our various connections with the product, as it were. So he made some very smart moves at the beginning, and he was incredibly well supported by New Line and their talent, and several unsung heroes like Jamie, who was the editor of the film, who was a hugely experienced, Jamie Selko, who was a hugely experienced editor and had worked with Peter on his early films, and I think really led Peter from being the sort of filmmaker in becoming, as it were, to the filmmaker who, you know, was able to be his own sure and certain person. You know, his contribution to enabling Peter to be Peter was huge. And then unquestionably Richard and Tanya and everybody at Weta Workshop who made visual reality what, you know, John and Alan had drawn on paper. That was a fantastic achievement. So, you know, I'm in great awe of those artists. I'm still doing stuff now. You know, I've just written the introduction to the 2002 HarperCollins Tolkien calendar, which here is featuring Ted Naismith's Silmarillion paintings. So I was talking to Ted about that, and I've just written a piece about his pictures and the fact that it is, or it will be next year, the anniversary of the publication of the Silmarillion. And I still remember what a revelation that book was when it came out, because it was just like, wow, here's this thing we knew about, and I'm now, we're now able to read it. It's like,
Yeah.
You've got a young Hobbit there.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I've got a couple of them running around here a little bit. So you mentioned earlier kind of the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in terms of the films. One of the things that I always looked at, and I don't know if I would just say, oh, this is why it's doesn't work as well. But one of the things I thought, just the production timeline that Peter and everyone was dealing with, Guillermo del Toro drops out, and then, Warner Brothers is ready to pull the plug on the whole thing unless Peter steps in. That was really the only way to save the project. So he does. And I think it was something like a year and a half. And you look at, what he did on pre-production wise on Lord of the Rings, he was preparing stuff, almost a decade before they started rolling. And I can't help but look at that and say, it's really hard to imagine that that you're setting yourself up for success on such a tight schedule.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary that, and I think, well, ask anybody who worked on it. I think everybody was constantly chasing, just chasing themselves to try and get stuff done. I remember talking to people at Weta Digital where they hadn't slept for hours. They would sleep on a sleeping bag on the floor and then get up and do some more work. And everybody just killed themselves to get it done. And as I say, it's an extraordinary, in that sense, it's an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah.
I wish for Peter that he had been able, if he was going to make it, and it was never his intention, as you say, to make it.
Right.
He'd given up that long ago. Originally, yes, make The Hobbit, then make The Lord of the Rings. That was his aim. But he'd let go of that. He'd done what he wanted to do. And he wanted to move on to other things, and had moved already on to other things. And I don't think he had the eagerness to revisit it particularly. So he did it through duty, and did it, incredibly well. But I wish for him that he had had the opportunity to have prepared for The Hobbit in the way that he was, as you say, was able to prepare for Lord of the Rings. And I think if he'd had the time to do that, I think he might have made some different choices. I think he would have let go of some things, been less indulgent, perhaps, if that's not too strong a term to use, elsewhere. And I think if he had wanted to sew the two together in the way that he eventually did, he would have maybe found a different way of doing it. I don't think he could have ever been expected to just make The Hobbit as it stands. I don't think he could have done that. And the moment certainly that he'd got Ian McKellen back, there was no way that he could ever just have Gandalf wander off and it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But and he had to tie in so much stuff. If you were going to be with the spiders in Mirkwood, you've got all that weight of the fact of the scenes with Shelob from The Lord of the Rings in your head. There's all that stuff there. So, a difficult task, a hugely difficult choice to have made. Some brilliant moments in it. I'm sad for him that despite all that effort, I don't think it will have the status of The Lord of the Rings. I mean,
what does really?
Maybe that was it, and maybe he knew that. Maybe, he knew that. What I mean is, maybe that was another reason for not wanting to go back to it, because how can you better the thing that you've just done so well? And with all the problems that the book presents you with, which is that a lot of the story doesn't have the weight of background and setting that The Lord of the Rings has. You mentioned in Western Lands in the radio version. I also think of a moment in the radio version where we hear Gil-galad was an elven king. on Weathertop, and there's no explanation really about, other than the fact that this is something from the deep past. There's history in this place, and that's what makes, of course, well, to me anyway, is what makes the Lord of the Rings as a book so fantastic. Is that it's this complex tapestry, and that although, I mean, for example, I know you wanted to ask me about Amazon. Of course, I know nothing about what Amazon's going to do, other than the fact that they've got the appendices to work from, and that they have got to be canonical, and they can't do anything or set up anything that's outside the time frames that Tolkien described. Mm-hmm. But there is this in the Lord of the Rings. There is this constant. The book is constantly locked into the history of the Silmarillion in what sometimes only narrowly. I mean, the fact that Shelob is the child of Ungoliant, or descendant of Ungoliant, links it back to the Silmarillion. The fact that the Dead Marshes, we know what that battle was when those elven warriors were slain and lying there in the marshes and seen by Frodo and Sam and Gollum. So all those links, Weathertop, what the place Weathertop was, the history of Rivendell, the history of Moria, all of those things, and Lothlorien, all of that stuff is bedded into sometimes only fragments, sometimes deeply detailed stories. And The Hobbit does not have that. Tolkien tried to align it more with the Lord of the Rings, expanding not expanding, but changing totally the Gollum Riddles in the Dark chapter to make it in line with the Gollum that had emerged in writing the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
But apart from that, there is this other subtext is not there. And so you still read The Hobbit, even with its changes, pretty much as is. You don't need to know that back history. Right. Because largely Tolkien hadn't actually established that there was a link to the world that he was already separately creating. So I think it was a really difficult challenge, and only somebody who could have approached it independently and said, I'm not going to be burdened by any of that. I'm just going to tell this story in the way. And of course, we will never know. I mean, I've seen images that, were hidden images. Well, hidden, I mean, images that nobody's allowed to see of the maquettes. I've seen some of the maquettes that Guillermo del Toro made. All of that artwork and stuff which exists, which I doubt will ever be seen by anybody now. So we will never know. That will be the unmade, one of the great unmade films, possibly.
Yeah.
And Peter's version is probably not what he ever really wanted to truly make. But there's a completion to it all. There's a round to it all.
Absolutely. And like you said, there's some truly great moments and truly great performances. There's definitely things to appreciate there. But yeah, we will always be curious about, what Guillermo del Toro's version would have been. I can only imagine, with I remember really enjoying Pan's Labyrinth, for example, probably one of his better known films. And, he's done all kinds of other films since then, Hellboy and stuff like that. So was it, I won't make you, or ask you to reveal anything that you shouldn't reveal, but was there a definite Guillermo del Toro feel to the images that you did see? Yeah,
I'd say it was uniquely his own, and wouldn't have fitted with the Lord of the Rings, but I don't think it would have needed to.
Yeah.
Problem. But the moment Peter was on board, it had to be Peter's vision.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know Pete. Yeah. I think Peter even said, he can't make a Guillermo del Toro film. He has to make a Peter Jackson film. That's how it works.
He was such a fan of del Toro. And I mean, which is why he would have been happy to have produced del Toro directed, because he loved the man's work. Why would he not? I can see exactly what Peter saw in that.
Absolutely. Work. So revisiting your the audio dramas, one of the kind of comparing it with the films, I've read multiple people that are big fans of your audio dramas. You know, they say it's arguably the most faithful adaptation you'll find of the Lord of the Rings. And one of the things that I noticed, one of the big things that stuck out to me was, you know, you keep the character of Aragorn. You know, he's not, you know, doubtful of himself like he is in the films, which I totally understand why they did that for the films. You know, I'm not, you know, bashing the films in any way. They're my favorite of all time. But I think that was one of my favorite things about the audio drama was getting that more book accurate Aragorn. It was just, you know, the first time I had experienced that in other than just reading the books.
I think that there is about Tolkien's characters, many of the characters actually, not just Aragorn, there is a real sense of destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Destiny is a very strong, it's a strong part of the kind of literary roots from which Tolkien was writing. You know, the great ballads and legends and tales are often about people fulfilling destiny. You know, it's not just a kind of, we'll see how things work out, and I may see that there is a destiny, and the destiny may be for ill or good. It may not be always for good, but even the sense of despair or disaster can be part of that destiny.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, probably what I wanted to convey most with Aragorn, was that it was his destiny. But as you say, absolutely, I can see that one of the problems with, having said this is part of that heroic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
That is not very human, sympathetic.
Yeah.
We don't. We want characters who are fallible. If we're to identify and associate with heroes, we need to know that that there is a possibility of their failing, and that they may have their weakness. I mean, that's also there in the book, of course, as well.
Mm-hmm.
All of the you know, even Sauron alone, and Saruman too, both have their weaknesses. They both have their failings, and the failings are their undoings. Maybe their arrogance, or it may be their total belief in themselves, but that they are still fallible. And I think that that's a quality that we identify with when we see that. We like our heroes, particularly now. I mean, I mean, obviously, film in the historically, you know, the Robin Hoods and the King Arthurs and all the rest of it. You know, that's one way of looking at those characters, and we like strong characters, but we also like there to be a vulnerability about characters. And many of the most successful film characters are characters which have enough failings or insecurities or uncertainties that mean that we can identify with them. They're not just so godlike or hero-like that they don't. I mean, even now, I mean, compared with how it was in the 1950s, say, or 60s, the superheroes now have their flaws.
Right.
They are no longer just sort of totally, you know, titanium-built machines who are able to do anything and always be supremely successful. You know, we know now that we want heroes to have vulnerabilities, and I think that's what Viggo brought. I mean, I thought Viggo's performance was fantastic, actually.
Oh, absolutely.
And he fleshed out a character who could be described as being, you know, like a kind of a legendary hero.
Yeah.
In the book. But yes, I think that was probably the route I deliberately took. If I have regrets now, I'm not going to say I've got regrets about Tom Bombadil, because I don't. There's been a rather heated exchange on my Facebook page recently, because I was explaining yet again why I did Tom Bombadil, Old Man Willow, and the Barrow-wights. But the point was that I didn't include them because for me, the moment the Black Riders show up and they're on the trail of the hobbits, that's the motor that drives the story.
Yeah.
Going on a detour, however enticing that may have been, and however unique Tom is, because he's the sole character in the book who seems to be able to handle the ring and be untouched by it and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, as somebody pointed out to me recently, if Tolkien had thought he was superfluous, he wouldn't have had the long conversation between Gandalf and Tom on the homeward bound journey.
Yeah.
I accept all of that. But for me, once you've got a bunch of sinister black riders galloping around on black horses with hissing voices, that's what you've got to stick with.
Yeah.
Until they get to whatever the next point of call is, which is, first of all, Bree, and then finally Rivendell, where the horses are, overcome. The riders are overcome at the ford of ice.
Right.
But so for me, it was always that's the incentive, and adding to that when Tolkien was writing, at the point when he took that diversion, and shortcuts make long delays, and that would have made a long delay in the story. But also at that point, he did not yet know exactly how the story was going to pan out. Even when he's writing the meeting at Bree, and Ryder is still possibly Trotter or whatever, he still is saying to Christopher, who's in the Second World War, getting a letter saying that he doesn't yet know who this character is. And that, to me, that is coming around full circle. But that, to me, is what is so special about The Lord of the Rings as a book, is that it isn't written by a man who was a established novelist and writer who sat down and said, this is the story I'm going to tell. It's going to have this plot point followed by that plot point. He didn't do that. He told the story as he wrote it. And fanciful, but I would say as he discovered the story. For him, it was a journey of discovery all the way along. And as he discovered more things, so other areas opened out or linked into things that he'd been writing or thinking about or creating in terms of the Silmarillion. That process is what holds the story, makes the story so compelling, that the person who was telling it didn't know at day one how it was going to end at day whatever it was. And the other thing which it has, which is it has an immediacy, which is to do with telling a story without a view to publication. You see it in a lot of writing. We did a lot of it children's literature, incidentally. Wind in the Willows, The Hobbit, of course, largely written and told at the same time. The Tale of Peter Rabbit, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. All of these stories began as narratives that were told to, in most cases, a child. Story that was invented, rather like you might with your youngsters. You'd be telling them a story, and tonight, and I'll tell you a bit more tomorrow, and then tomorrow you make up tomorrow.
Right.
And that quality in a book, and that's not quite the same with Lord of the Rings, but there is a sense of discovery about the book, that what you are hearing, what you're reading rather, or hearing if you're listening to it, or watching if you're seeing it in a film, what you're experiencing is the process of the writer experiencing the story. And that's why whatever the literary shortcomings of the Lord of the Rings are, and there are, I would say most English critics would say there are shortcomings, whatever those shortcomings are, they are totally and utterly compensated for by this sense of discovery, that you, the reader, discover the next moment at the point when the writer himself discovers it as he's writing it down. That moment on the brink of a crack of doom, where just for a split second, Frodo, who's been all along burdened with it, but manage to carry that burden. At that moment, he almost fails. You know, there is vulnerability built in, but that you are poised on the edge of that abyss with him, and you don't know how it's going to end. And the same, of course, when Pippin, is it Pippin or is it Merry? I'm confused now. Before the Black Gates, blacks out rather as Bilbo does at the end of The Hobbit.
Pippin, yeah.
It's Pippin, and he falls unconscious and just hears, you know, the cry, the eagles are coming, the eagles are coming. But you know, there are these moments where the writer does not have everything tied up and sewn up. There's still this moment of discovery, and that's why I think we go back to the book and back to the book and back to the book again and again, because each time we read it, it has this fresh, I'm living this. Now, of course, the truth is that text was overworked and reworked again and again and again. It was not as simple as that.
Right.
The essence of the storytelling from the beginning through to that climax, well, I'm back, anti-climax, you know, I mean, what a way to end the story. It's like, and it's an end which is also in some strange way a beginning as well, because you know this is the beginning of another life for this character. I love it.
Me too. Absolutely. Well, I want to be conscious of your time here. I did have a couple more questions. You mentioned the Amazon series. Obviously, you know, we're all kind of in the dark about most of it. But do you have any, you know, when you heard they were going to be making a show based on the Second Age, do you have any thoughts or things that you hope to see?
Well, of course, they've got amazing stuff that they can use. I mean, you know, Fall of Numenor, the Forging of the Rings. You know, I mean, great stuff. Battles, you know, the fleeing from Numenor, the ships. I mean, there's so much visual visual material there. The hard thing, I think, will be to give well, say hard thing. I'm sure they've got very good writers, but they need to be able to flesh out those characters, because where Tolkien has not given us, you know, that
we have almost no dialogue to work with.
No, practically none. You know, sometimes just an event, a date, an event. You know, the Chronicles of the Kings of Numenor, for instance. You know, I mean, most of them, they are just names and dates. We don't have the detail of them. So yeah, there are references, and there are references in the history, in the 12 volumes of the history of Middle Earth, but not that many. Stuff in the Silmarillion at the end, of course, about Numenor. Unfinished Tales, there's a few as well, Peoples of Middle Earth, but not a lot, which is great, because it means that it gives the freedom to the writers. Nobody's going to say, well, that's not what they said in the book, which is what you get if you're writing a radio play or making a film. I didn't say that.
Where's Tom Bombadil?
They have got the freedom to do an awful lot of creative writing, and if they've got people on board, it's got a lot of potential dramatic stuff. I don't know how far they'll be able to reference stuff forward or back. You know, I'm not clear about that. I don't know. But you know, the first season is 20 episodes, we understand, which is quite something. And how many seasons? Well, we don't know. But then they have got 3,441 years to cover. So which is the span of the Second Age. So you know, they've got plenty of scope there. I think the challenge, the real challenge they face, is calling it the Lord of the Rings, really. And I think that's quite a problem for them, because people will expect, there will be an expectation amongst a lot of people that this is going to be a new Lord of the Rings, which it can't be.
Right.
Can't be. Legally, it can't be. So why would it anyway? Who'd want to remake it?
Right.
I mean, it'd be remade in 100 years' time or something if people are still making movies. But it's not going to be remade in our lifetime, and nor ought it to be, because it would be folly. Although that hasn't stopped a lot making a lot of perfectly adequate movies, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon with the Lord of the Rings. So they're burdened with a title which has expectations, and we shouldn't forget that, of course, for all of the fans, people like yourself and many of your viewers who care about the book and are passionate about the book or the books, and therefore they are rooted in the material itself. Many, many fans of the Lord of the Rings film trilogy and the Hobbit trilogy, I'm sure, maybe less so, were experts on the text. They were fans of the movies. I mean, somebody left a funny comment on my Facebook page and said, I couldn't believe it when we saw The Fellowship of the Ring, and I'd gone with a bunch of friends, and I walked out and I said, well, that's a funny way to end a movie. And he said, my friend said, it's the first volume of a trilogy. Well, not true, but anyway, it's the first of 3 films. Oh, I didn't know that. So there are many people who became fans of the films without having ever been fans of the books. I probably never did go and read the books, because that is their Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Maybe true of the radio, I don't know, as well. And there are people for whom that is all they need to know about it. But of course, there are many other people who are steeped in the history of Middle Earth, not just the Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion and Christopher Tolkien's astonishing 12 volumes of archaeology, as I think of it, who will be attuned to everything that is possibly being picked up or not picked up. But they've got a lot of freedom, and there's an appetite for these products. As there was with Game of Thrones. I mean, except when it came to the end, when everybody seemed to lose interest in it. Yeah, curious. So it's now a brand. It seems to me, a fantasy brand that I'm sure can carry it, and I'm sure if they do it well, and they're filming in New Zealand, I don't know how much of the scenery of New Zealand is going to figure there, but probably less so now, because ironically, when Peter made the first 3 films, the locations were so much part of it. I mean, it seems to me that so much of the magic of the Lord of the Rings is those real locations. When you see for the first time Edoras, when you see Medusel, when you see the Golden Hall standing on the top of that mound, that to my mind was just like a utterly magical moment. It was just like, it wasn't a model, but this was a real place. And as the camera or helicopter shot flew around, and you saw Eowyn standing there looking out. I mean, utterly entrancing. I mean, it was just like, that's Middle Earth.
Right.
And there are many, many other moments in the film like that, of course.
Absolutely.
Everywhere where there was those moments of absolute, this is real, it's a real place. Well, I'm sure I hope they can do that. And if they can do that, and if they can tell their story compellingly, and if they can make the characters real, but still make them have, I hope, enough of the nuance of what the type of, what do I mean by this? The kind of manner of the characters. I don't mean that they have to talk in a kind of archaic way, but they need to have some kind of authority in the way that they speak and act. I'm sure they will achieve that. But as in Game of Thrones, there's nothing sloppy about it. You believe in these characters as who they are. They have to create that, but they have to create it for a lot of people who are either going to be expecting another Gandalf movie, or are hoping that it will be in some way like this other thing that they really liked. And can it be like that? I don't know. Or will it be different? And if it is different, will that be good? Or I've got more. I've got no answers. Any questions?
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah,
But
it'll be interesting.
and I'm intrigued to see. And good luck to whoever's doing the tie-in books for it. That's all I can say.
Well, I wanted to ask about one last thing, and then I've got a few rapid fire fun questions about your favorite things of Middle Earth. So you've also done audio dramas for another Tolkien work, Tales from the Perilous Realm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier Chronicles of Narnia as well. So I was curious, and you've also written books on C.S. Lewis, Narnia. What you know, what kind of your I'm just curious of your thoughts and your approach to Narnia and how it's maybe similar and how maybe it's different with Middle Earth.
Yeah, it is quite different. I mean, I was obsessed with Narnia as a very young kid. Read the Lord of the Rings. Move on to the other books now. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was sickly in bed with some kid's disease. I don't know what it was, mumps or measles or chicken pox or something. And it was lent to me by a friend. And I got frightened when Aslan was killed and stopped reading the book. Didn't read it till later. And I gave it back to the friend who lent it to me. And she said, "What did you think of it?" And I said, "I didn't like it. It was scary." And she said, "Well, but it's all right at the end." I said, "I didn't read the end." And she said, "I think you better read it again." And I totally believed in Narnia. And I still do in a funny kind of way. I know that sounds a bit fey, but I really do believe in a sense that Narnia exists in some kind of way. I don't know quite what I mean by that. In my imagination, there are places that exist that are, I can't say truthfully exist, but they exist to me as a near personal kind of reality, and Narnia is one of them. Probably the strongest, actually, because it consumed me before Tolkien. I climbed into my parents' double-fronted wardrobe when they were out shopping or something and shut the door, not quite closed because the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe had told the children never to close the door, or rather the writer, Mr. Lewis, told us that. And I sat there thinking, my eyes screwed up, that if I really, 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 really wanted it, the back of this wardrobe would disappear. And that's how true I believed it. And I was always slightly embarrassed about telling that story for years and years and years, until one day I was visiting who I mentioned earlier, Roger Lansing Green, who was, of course, very strong association with Lewis and Tolkien, and Tolkien's biographer. And I said, "It's a weird thing to say that I did that. I feel a bit foolish in saying it." He said, "Oh, come with me." And he took me into this was his family's home that he'd inherited. And there was a fireplace in this room with a big overmantel, a big mirror above the mantelpiece. And he said, "I was so obsessed with Alice's stories that when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my parents came in and found me on the mantelpiece there trying to get through the looking glass." And the moment he told me that, I didn't feel embarrassed about saying I once tried to get through the back of a wardrobe, because that's how strongly the world, Lewis's world, obsessed me. For two reasons. One, because at first I didn't see it. And then when I did see it, I was never disturbed by the allegorical nature of Lewis's books.
Yeah.
I grew up in a church-going, Christian believing family, still am. And to me, I saw them as being allegorical. So I was never disturbed by it. It never came to me as a shock that Aslan's death and coming back to life was an analogy of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ.
Right.
Never seemed to me wrong. But I understand people who felt deceived by it, and there are many, and who don't have any don't want to buy into that belief, that it seems subversive to have fed children a story which appears to be a fantasy, but which has got these deeply spiritual parallels going on. To me, the creation episodes in the magician's nephew and the apocalyptic scenes at the end of the last battle are some of the most powerful scenes in the books, and I love them. And yeah, I believed that one day I might find a way into Narnia. When I read the next book, of course, I discovered that you can't get to Narnia through the same route. So I tried to get through the back of wardrobes at that. I still thought that there might be a way through a picture, as in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader or whatever. So I've never lost my affection for Lewis. It dulled slightly through my deep friendship, long-lasting friendship with Pauline Baynes, when I discovered that he had been really very critical of her work, which to me is Narnia.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I just look at those. To me, you know, if I just think Narnia, then I see that lamp in amongst the trees covered in snow, or I think of the Edmund looking across the lake to the White Witch's castle, or I think of that wonderful cover that she did for Over Here, anyway, for a paperback version of Fledge the Flying Horse, with Diggory and Polly sitting on its back, and the whole of the Narnia landscape laid out. And it's just breathtaking. But anyway, so yeah, I've always loved Lewis. I've always felt that there is room in the world to, in your mind or your heart or your imagination, just keep a little kind of belief that there are places, you know, Oz, Wonderland, Moominland. Nobody knows about Moomins in America, I don't think. But, you know, there are loads of fictional places which sometimes, particularly if you're, as I was, a young, sickly kid growing up on my own with no brothers or sisters, not mixing much with my peers, become as real as the real world. And if when with my dying breath, if there is anything outside of this existence that we have here, and if it isn't just a tidge like the Narnia at the end of the last battle, I will be deeply, deeply distressed. I'm not sure what your first part of that question was. I've gone off.
Oh no, that was great. Yeah.
Well, they were different. They were intentionally. The chronicles were geared for a younger audience, so that's the aim of the series very much. Had a strong cast over the years with some great performers playing the parts. The actor who played Treebeard, a guy called Stephen Thorne, played Aslan in all of the 7 Chronicles and had his amazing voice. And he was a wonderful actor. To me, he's only the voice of it. I can only hear as the voice of Aslan. I've watched the movies or the ones that have been made. They're okay. You know, they've got some good stuff in them. I wasn't involved in any way with them, but there's things in there that I like a lot. You know, Lewis has got his failings in characters. He's very bad at creating girl characters, I think, for the most part. Certainly Susan. Lucy's a very strong, well-formed character. But, you know, he's, you know, I mean, this is a man who, at the time he was writing these books, was pretty misogynist and unmarried and mixed in this very, very chummy guys club. You know, I mean, even people who were married, like Tolkien, you know, Edith Tolkien wasn't part of the Inklings. She didn't, you know, go along and listen to them reading their poems or their chunks of legendary text. So, you know, he had a home life and a writing world, Oxford type life.
Right.
And, you know, Lewis, you know, was pretty much immune to understanding women until he fell in love much later in life.
Right.
And I think that was as problematic for people like Tolkien and Charles Williams and his other friends as it was for Lewis, because they couldn't quite understand what had happened to him. You know, he's something fallen in love. But I still love the books dearly, and there's such a kind of cross current between the two writers and their two worlds. The differences are that Lewis wrote quickly, I'm going to say daringly, sloppily, because he didn't bother about you know, the chronologies of things, or
Right.
you know, if you went back to Narnia and it was a few years later, well, everything was changed, but there was no deep thinking about how it had changed or why it had changed. Why had Cair Paravel fallen into ruins when they come back in Prince Caspian? Didn't really bother to, you know, whereas Tolkien would have had a whole story about the fall of Cair Paravel, you know. So he's not like Lewis in that, Tolkien in that sense. He just wanted to tell a good yarn and told it in the way that he wanted to. And, you know, as we know, Tolkien hated the fact that Father Christmas appears in The Land of Witches. He couldn't cope with the fact that here was a man who was writing what was clearly a thinly veiled Christian allegory, and muddled up in it was a character like Bacchus and fauns and, you know, other characters from Greek mythology, which were not the most salubrious of characters. You know, what the hell were they doing in a story where there was a talking lion who was supposed to be Jesus? So, you know, I can see Tolkien's frustrations in all of that, but there's nevertheless a sense of the same urge to create, which is what I guess, you know, united those guys anyway, and Charles Williams as well. So yeah, a different approach, but, you know, throughout it all, writing about the land of Narnia got me much closer to Pauline Baynes, and you know, we remained close friends. My husband and David and myself used to be regular visitors and spend time with her. And we loved her dearly, and I treasure her friendship enormously. So yeah, all linked. One of the things that I've been very lucky in my life is that almost everything I've done has come out of things that I love. And the only good stuff I've ever done has been from those sources and origins. Once in a while, I've done a job because I needed the money. I needed to do a job for somebody, and I needed a crust. So I took on a job that I wasn't really maybe happy with, and the result was never satisfying. But all those others, all the good stuff, for all the, you know, difficulties, maybe, you know, because there were a lot of problems in making the radio series, a lot of challenges, as they say today, and a lot of issues in connection with the movies. But despite all of that, they were things which gave me great, deep, lasting pleasure. But they came out of things that I already loved. And that's true of, you know, it's true of when I did the Narnia Chronicles. It's true when I did the Mervyn Peake Gormenghast stories, because I became a close friend of Mervyn Peake's widow, Maeve Gilmore, and that relationship was, you know, what fired that ability to transfer his very idiosyncratic stories onto radio, and my passion for T.H. White's The Once a Future King, which grew out of seeing The Sword in the Stone, Walt Disney's movie. We haven't touched it, but, you know, Disney's a major obsession in my life. Seeing The Sword in the Stone, going and buying the paperback because I wanted to read the story of this movie I'd just seen and loved, and finding it was not very much like the film, but was totally magical and bizarre and wonderful, and you know, it had this character of Merlin, who was not the Merlin I'd read of in Tennyson or Malory. This was a Merlin who lived backwards through time and wore a deerstalker and smoked a meerschaum pipe and knew about electricity. And, you know, it was eccentric and wild and amazing. So, and Ray Bradbury, you know, as a kid, when I discovered the book by Ray, who became a friend of mine for 30 years, we were friends later in life. But as a kid, I'd picked up a paperback called The Golden Apples of the Sun, which is the most magical title in the world. And it had fantastic images on the front, which I later discovered were Goya monsters and grotesques. I didn't know that then, but they looked amazing. And on the back of the book, it said, Ray Bradbury takes you inside imagination, and the word imagination was printed backwards, and I thought this was so cool. And I took this book home, and the first story was called The Foghorn, and it was about a sea monster. It became the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in movies years later, made by of which the sea monster was created by Ray Bradbury's all-time long-term friend, Ray Harryhausen, another great giant of my early life. And I read this story about a sea monster that falls in love with a foghorn sounding lighthouse, and I was entranced. And I remember it was this bright, sunny July day, birthday, around my birthday. And my family was sitting in the garden enjoying the sun. And I just sat in my room reading. I had to read all these stories, and I had to read them right now. And then I was scampering back to the library to get Something Wicked This Way Comes, or Dandelion Wine, or any other book that had the magical names Ray Bradbury on the cover. And then I wrote Ray Bradbury a letter, a fan letter, and he wrote back, and a long letter, 2 pages, and I couldn't believe it. Well, I did believe it, because I just thought anybody I write to is going to write back to me. The fact that he was a famous American writer didn't occur to me that he wouldn't. So I wrote back again, and we started a correspondence that eventually became meeting whenever I was in LA or he was in London. We corresponded. I've got hundreds of letters from Ray. He was a dear friend. And then lo and behold, some years later, I get an idea. I asked the BBC, what do they think about it? And so I make a radio series called Tales of the Bizarre. And these are all Ray's, I'm dramatizing Ray's stories. And then Ray agrees to introduce them vocally. So, all of these things just have fed out of these discoveries and joys of my early youth. And that, I've not done anything very creative of my own, very little. All I've done is just point other people to other people's greatness, I think. But if I've done that, well, I'm happy.
That's an amazing sentiment, I feel like, to conclude with. And yeah, I can definitely relate to the feeling of just pointing people toward greatness, with this little YouTube channel that I'm running here. And for what it's worth, I think your dramatization of Lord of the Rings will always be among my favorite things. And in my personal opinion, I feel like you achieved greatness yourself with that work. So I greatly appreciate it. I would like to wrap up with some fun rapid fire questions for you. Some a little kind of get to know you quiz on some of your favorite things in Middle Earth. So
Right.
So who is your favorite Middle Earth character?
Oh, Gollum, no question.
Great.
Yeah, has to be Gollum, just simply because he's so tortured and so multifaceted, and the scenes, my favorite scenes, obviously in the book, and indeed in the film and the radio versions, or any version, is those dialogues between, good Gollum, bad Gollum are just amazing. Yeah, no question, Gollum. But of course, then you go, oh yeah, but hang on a minute. Quite fond of Treebeard too, and of course Frodo, because Frodo is just an amazing character. And Sam, oh yes, yeah, I'll stick with Gollum because it's probably what I have to stick with.
Yeah, I think many of us who are big Tolkien fans could probably rationalize just about any answer for that. So what is your favorite Tolkien book?
My favorite Tolkien book, I think, is Tree and Leaf. Sorry, this is really wacky, I know, but not so much on fairy stories, although I've learned a lot from it, and I still learn from it when I read it. Tolkien's thoughts about writing and fairy stories and legend. But Leaf by Nigel, apart from the fact that it's written by a man who said that he hated allegory wherever he could smell it, and it is an allegory, and it's an allegory of his Catholic Christian faith, but also is the story of himself creating something that grows and grows and grows and gets out of control almost, but then becomes something which has its own reality and lives in its own way. So it's a story which moves me to tears when I read it. I find it just entrancing and perfect. And yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not comparing it with The Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, but for me, it's a very, very special story. And I dramatized it as part of the Tales of the Perilous Realm.
Right.
And I love it. I also love, because it's such a little gem, I love Smith and Wotton Major too, which is just perfect. And it's like a little miniature, you know, this man who created this enormous canvas of extraordinary dimensions was able to create this little miniature. I love that book too.
Great.
Leaf Buniggle.
Perfect. So if you lived in Middle Earth, what race of person would you be? A dwarf, elf, man, hobbit, Beorning? Take your pick.
Ah, that's an interesting question. When we did the radio version, I wrote a scene. There's a scene in Mordor where there are two orcs on the Gorgoroth Road talking about, and it's a kind of superfluous scene really, but it's character. And I wrote it with a view to Michael Bakewell and myself playing the parts of these two orcs as a sort of cameo joke. Anyway, the scene got cut and it didn't happen. But so I know I certainly wouldn't be an orc. I'd hope not. I don't think at all. I think I'd quite like to live in Rivendell, actually. I think that would be, so I think I'd probably want to be, although I was absolutely no physical likelihood of my ever being or looking like an elf. I think I would, I think that's where I would most want to live, if I can think of it like that. Orders of living places would be Rivendell, because I think it's probably peaceful and beautiful and idyllic. Maybe LOTHLorien, but it's a bit kind of maybe a bit dark, and I think I might get fed up with trees. I think I want to see a bit more than just trees. Minas Tirith I'd quite like to live in, because it seems like an amazing city to live in. But no, Hobbiton, no, not sure. I mean, I've stood in the real Hobbit hole now. I've done it in New Zealand. But no, I think Rivendell. So I'd be somebody elven in the court of Elrond, I think.
Yeah.
Great. I fancy that. I fancy that sound of elves singing at night and the waterfall, the river running below the buildings, and fancy that.
Great. And so last question, if what place in Middle Earth would you most like to visit but not live?
Fangorn, I think. I'd love to that. In fact, probably any of the woods, actually. Not Mirkwood, because I'm not that keen on spiders, so probably but Fangorn, I'd be that would, and I feel it would be like one of those amazing pictures that John Lee creates. It's based on a real place. I forgot the name of the wood at the moment. In Devon, which he uses with these moss-covered trees that are almost serpentine. You know, that's now how I kind of see areas of Fangorn. So Fangorn, I think I would quite like to go to. But if it was a city, then I think I'd choose Gondolin, obviously pre the fall.
Yes,
because Gondolin seems to me such a, and I'm seeing it as I'm saying this. I'm seeing Ted Naismith's very incarnations of Gondolin. So if it's out in the open country, I'll have Fangorn. If we're talking cities, then I'd like a short stay in Gondolin, but not to live there.
Yeah,
certainly not before.
Balrogs and dragons show up and everything.
I'll pass on that.
Yeah, we get the answer a lot. Moria is another one that it's like, if I get to pick the time period, I'll go visit Moria.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. Everyone, if you're interested, I highly, highly recommend that you check out the 1981 BBC dramatization of Lord of the Rings. It's I think available on pretty much any audiobook platform. I listen to it on Audible all the time. It is fantastic and fun new way to discover Middle Earth if you haven't listened to it before. I can't give it a high enough recommendation. Brian, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. If you're going to edit this, because it seems to have been going on for many, many hours now, I don't know how long we've been talking about, a long time. If you're going to edit any of this, be sensitive to anything you think is incredibly indiscreet or it out. But no, it's been a joy to be with you, Matt, and your viewers and listeners, because I never tire of talking about this subject, as you've guessed, and any opportunity, and this has been a particularly enjoyable opportunity. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you once again, and everyone, we will see you next time here on Nerd of the Rings.